thing about snow. There's something about snow that people don't think about often enough. We treat it like a season, like weather, like something that happens to the world and then melts and goes away. But snow doesn't just fall, it accumulates. And as it accumulates, it does two things that seem like they should cancel each other out, but don't. It preserves and it erases, simultaneously. A body under snow can remain almost untouched for months. Skin, hair, the expression on a face, all held in place like a photograph. But the footprints that led to that body, gone in hours, sometimes minutes. Snow is a perfect archivist with absolutely no loyalty to the truth. It will keep what it wants and destroy what it doesn't, and it won't tell you which is which until spring. I think about this every time I read about the Ural Mountains. The northern Urals in February are not a place built for people. They're barely a place built for geography. The tree line thins out around 900 meters, and above that, there's nothing but rock, ice, wind, and a particular quality of silence that doesn't feel like the absence of sound so much as the presence of something that prefers quiet. The Mansi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, had a name for one of the peaks in this range, Kholat Syakhl. It translates roughly to dead mountain, not deadly mountain, not dangerous mountain, dead. As in, already finished, already over. Whatever was going to happen here has happened, and the mountain is simply what's left. The Mansi named it that long before 1959, long before anyone had a reason to agree with them. In late January of that year, a group of 9 hikers, students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, set out on a skiing expedition across the northern Urals. Their destination was a peak called Otorten, about 10 kilometers north of Kholat Syakhl. It was a Category 3 route, the most difficult classification in the Soviet hiking system, and every member of the group held the experience to attempt it. Their leader, a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, had organized the expedition with the kind of meticulous planning that would make a logistics officer weep with envy. Route maps, waypoint schedules, equipment manifests, contingency plans. They set out, they moved through the mountains, they kept diaries, they took photographs, they argued about the best route, got slightly lost in poor visibility, corrected course, and made camp on the evening of February 1st on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. Dead mountain. None of them came off that mountain alive. Their bodies were found over the following weeks and months, some in February, the last not until May, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine. The Soviet investigation that followed was thorough by the standards of the era, which is to say, thorough enough to be confusing, and not quite thorough enough to be useful. Dozens of people were interviewed, evidence was cataloged, photographs were developed, autopsies were performed, and then the case was closed with a verdict that has haunted researchers for more than 6 decades. The official cause of death, as entered into the record by the lead investigator, was, and I want to be precise here because the phrasing matters, a compelling natural force. Not an avalanche, not exposure, not a fall, not an attack, a compelling natural force, a phrase so aggressively non-specific that it almost feels like a dare. You figure it out. We couldn't. The case files were sealed. They stayed sealed for 30 years. Now, if you've spent any time on the internet in the last 2 decades, you've probably encountered the Dyatlov Pass incident. It's become something of a greatest hit in the mystery community. Right up there with the Bermuda Triangle and the Zodiac Killer on the list of things people argue about at 2 in the morning when they should be sleeping. And the theories that tend to circulate are the big ones, the dramatic ones. Avalanche, military cover-up, secret weapons testing, indigenous attack, something with lights in the sky that people don't like to name directly because it makes them feel silly, even though there are actually documented witness reports, which we'll get to. But that's not what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the details that nobody talks about, the small ones, the ones that sit in the margins of the official report, like footnotes that forgot to attach themselves to anything. The ones that by themselves don't mean much. A strange piece of clothing, a camera in the wrong place, a number that keeps showing up, a tree with blood on the bark 5 meters off the ground. Individually, each of these details has an explanation, a reasonable one usually. The kind of explanation that makes you nod and move on. But here's the thing about reasonable explanations. They work best in isolation. Line them up. Put 10 reasonable explanations in a row, one after another, each one requiring you to set aside a slightly different piece of the picture. And at some point, reasonable starts to curdle into something else, something that feels less like logic and more like effort. Like someone is working very hard to make sure all of this makes sense, and the harder they work, the less it does. The group's last diary entry is dated February 1st. Their tent was found on February 26th. That's 25 days. But the investigation didn't formally open until, well, that depends on which document you read. The chronology in the official file has gaps, not large ones, just odd ones. The kind where a date on one page doesn't quite match the date on another, and nobody corrected it, and you're left wondering if it matters, or if you're the kind of person who sees patterns in static. I might be that kind of person. I've been reading this file for a long time. So here's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to tell you the story of what happened on Kholat Syakhl. The clean version first, the one that made it into the official report. And then slowly, I'm going to take it apart. Not with theories, not with speculation, just with the details that are already there, sitting in the evidence, waiting for someone to line them up and ask the obvious question, which is not what happened. The question is, why does every answer require you to ignore something? This isn't a ghost story. It's worse than that. It's a story where everything is real, everything is documented, and nothing, not one piece of it, makes sense the way it should. Get comfortable. We'll be here for a while. The clean version, the group. To understand what happened on Kholat Syakhl, you need to understand who was on that mountain. Not as a list of names, you can find that anywhere, but as a collection of decisions. Every person in this group made choices that put them on that slope on that night. Some of those choices were ordinary. Some of them, in hindsight, were not. The expedition was organized through the sports club at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, the city now called Yekaterinburg. Winter hiking in the Urals was not unusual for students at the institute. It was, in fact, something of a tradition. The mountains were accessible, the terrain was challenging, and the Soviet system of athletic classification gave young people a structured reason to push themselves into genuinely dangerous environments. A successful Category 3 expedition wasn't just a trip, it was a credential. It went on your record. It meant something. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old, a fifth-year student in the radio engineering faculty, and the kind of person who planned things the way other people breathed, automatically, thoroughly, and with a faint impatience for anyone who didn't. His expedition logs from previous trips read like engineering specifications, waypoints calculated to the kilometer, time estimates broken into half-hour blocks, equipment lists that accounted for redundancy. He was, by every account, exceptionally competent in the field. The kind of leader who inspired confidence not through charisma, but through the simple, reassuring impression that he had already thought of whatever you were about to worry about. He'd been planning this route for months. Otorten, the destination, sat about 65 kilometers north of their starting point. The route would take them through forested valleys, across frozen rivers, and above the tree line into the exposed highland terrain of the northern Urals. Category 3, approximately 16 days round trip. Dyatlov had done comparable routes before. So had most of the group. Zinaida Kolmogorova was 22, a student in the radio engineering faculty like Dyatlov. She was athletic, disciplined, and kept a diary on expeditions with the consistency of someone who understood that experience isn't useful unless you record it. Her entries from this trip are the most detailed, personal account we have of the group's dynamics in those final days. She wrote about the weather, always the weather first, with a hiker's reflexive attention to conditions. She wrote about small disagreements over route choices. She wrote about who was tired, who was in good spirits, who was dragging. She did not write about anything unusual. Not once. Not until there was nothing left to write. Lyudmila Dubinina was 21 and studying engineering economics. She was described by those who knew her as stubborn, opinionated, and physically tough. The kind of person who would argue about the best way to set up a tent and then outperform everyone the next morning on the trail. Her diary entries are shorter than Kolmogorov's, but sharper. More personality, less weather. She complained about wet boots and bad jokes and the monotony of dried rations. And reading her words 66 years later, she sounds exactly like every 21-year-old who has ever gone camping with friends and found it simultaneously wonderful and annoying. Alexander Kolovatov was 24, a physics student with a quiet reputation. He appears less frequently in the group's shared diary entries, not because he was antisocial, but because he seems to have been the kind of person who participated without drawing attention to himself. In photographs, he's often slightly to the side, smiling but not performing. He transferred to the Ural Polytechnic from an institute in Moscow, and some researchers have noted that his academic file contains minor inconsistencies. A gap year that doesn't quite align, a transfer that happened faster than the bureaucratic norms of the era would typically allow. These details have been seized upon by some theorists as evidence of something. Intelligence connections. A hidden agenda. The truth is more likely mundane. Soviet academic records were messy, and gaps in documentation were as common as gaps in the heating system. Rustam Slobodin was 23, an engineer who had already graduated and was working at a state enterprise. He joined the expedition as an experienced hiker and a friend of several group members. He was regarded as physically strong, steady in temperament, and reliable in the field. The kind of person you wanted on a winter expedition because he wouldn't panic, and he'd carry more than his share without being asked. Yuri Doroshenko was 21, the tallest member of the group at over 6 feet. He and Kolmogorova had been romantically involved at some point prior to the trip. The diaries hint at this without stating it directly, in the way that group dynamics always contain currents that everyone acknowledges and no one discusses. Doroshenko was physically imposing and reportedly easygoing, the social anchor of the group. Yuri Krivonishenko, the group called him Krivo, was 23 and working as an engineer at a state construction enterprise. He was the group's comedian. The diary entries that mention him almost always involve him telling jokes, singing songs, or doing something mildly ridiculous to keep morale up on long, cold days. He had a guitar with him, or at least the group did, and he was the one who played it. He was also, and this will become relevant later, the member of the group who had previously worked at a facility connected to the Chelyabinsk 40 nuclear complex, the Mayak facility. The site of the 1957 Kishdym disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, a full 2 years before this expedition. Krivonishenko was there. He was involved in the cleanup. He was exposed to radiation. This fact sits in his biographical record like a stone in a shoe, and we'll come back to it. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol was 23, the son of a French-born father who had been repressed under Stalin. His name alone made him conspicuous in 1950s Soviet Russia, but by all accounts, he wore it lightly. He was described as cheerful, energetic, and possessed of a slightly sardonic sense of humor that suggests he'd made his peace with standing out in a society that preferred you didn't. And then there was Semyon Zolotaryov. Zolotaryov was 38. In a group of students and recent graduates in their early 20s, he was an immediate outlier, not just in age, but in bearing. He was a World War II veteran, decorated, with a service record that spanned multiple fronts. After the war, he'd become a sports instructor and hiking guide, which explained his interest in the expedition. What explained less was how he ended up on it. Zolotaryov had not been part of the original group. He joined late, replacing another hiker named Bienko who dropped out. The circumstances of this substitution are unremarkable on paper. People swap in and out of expedition rosters all the time, but the speed of it has raised eyebrows. Zolotaryov didn't know the group well. He had a connection to one of the members through a mutual hiking club, but he wasn't a friend. He wasn't a classmate. He was a 38-year-old military veteran with a background that, if you dug into it, contained the kind of vagueness that could mean nothing or could mean everything. His full military service record has never been made completely public. He went by Sasha on the expedition, though that wasn't his name. His close friends, of whom there are to have been few, knew him as Semyon. The group knew him as Sasha. He carried a camera. Everyone carried cameras. The group had several, and the photographs they took on the trip are a primary visual record of the expedition. But Zolotaryov's camera was his. Personal, and he kept it close. We'll come back to that too. The 10th member of the expedition was Yuri Yudin. He deserves a particular kind of attention because he's the crack in the story that lets the light in, or doesn't, depending on how you look at it. Yudin started the trip with the group. He hiked with them for the first 2 days, and then, on January 28th, he turned back. Sciatic pain in his leg, a chronic condition that flared in the cold. He said goodbye to his friends at the base of the mountains, watched them ski away into the forest, and went home. He was 21 years old. He would live to be 75. And he would spend the remaining 54 years of his life trying to understand why he was alive and they were not. Yudin's interviews, given over decades to journalists, researchers, and filmmakers, are a masterclass in the evolution of grief. In the early years, he spoke with the shocked numbness of a young man who couldn't process the randomness of survival. By middle age, the grief had calcified into something more analytical. He studied the case, read the files, visited the site, and developed theories with the rigor of someone who needs the answer the way other people need air. By the end, in his final interviews before his death in 2013, he had settled into a kind of exhausted certainty that was more unsettling than any theory. He didn't know what happened, but he knew, with the bone-deep conviction of someone who'd spent a lifetime looking, that the official explanation was wrong. "If I could ask God one question," he said in a late interview, "it would be, what really happened to my friends that night?" There's a photograph taken at the trailhead on January 27th, the day the expedition officially began. All 10 are in it, Yudin included, since he hadn't turned back yet. They're standing in front of a wooden building, loaded packs on their backs, ski poles in hand, squinting in the winter light. They look like what they are: young, fit, slightly cocky, perfectly ordinary. The smiles are genuine. The confidence is unperformed. In the far right of the frame, slightly separated from the cluster, stands Zolotaryov. He's smiling too, but he's not leaning in the way the others are. He's standing at full height, shoulders square, with the posture of a man who's joining a group rather than belonging to one. It could mean nothing. It probably means nothing. But the photograph has been reproduced in every major account of the case, and Zolotaryov's position in it is always the detail people notice second, right after they've counted the faces and realized one of them is going to survive. #1B, the route and the night of February 122. The expedition's planned route followed a fairly standard path through the northern Urals. From the settlement of Vishay, their last contact with civilization, they would ski north along river valleys, through increasingly sparse forest, and eventually above the tree line to the peak of Otorten. The total distance was roughly 65 kilometers each way. In winter conditions with full packs, they expected to average about 15 to 20 kilometers per day. It was ambitious, but achievable for a group of their experience. The first several days went more or less according to plan. Diary entries described typical winter hiking conditions: cold, wind, the tedium of breaking trail through fresh snow, the small satisfactions of a well-pitched camp and a hot meal. There were minor tensions, debates about pace, about route variations, about whether to take a shortcut that would save time but increase exposure to wind. Normal group dynamics. Nothing in the written record from this period suggests anxiety, conflict, or awareness of anything unusual. On January 31st, they reached the Ospaya River Valley and cached a supply depot for their return journey. Extra food, spare equipment, items they wouldn't need for the summit push. This was standard practice. Lighten your load for the most demanding section. Retrieve your supplies on the way back. The cache was carefully assembled and buried. It would never be used. February 1st, the final day. They broke camp and began moving north toward Orton. The weather was deteriorating, not catastrophically, but steadily. Visibility dropped, wind increased, snow was falling. According to the group diary, they had intended to push through a highland pass and descend into the next valley, where they would make camp in the shelter of the tree line. This would have been the logical, experienced, textbook decision. Get below the exposed ridge, find trees for wind protection and firewood, set up camp in the most defensible position available. They didn't do that. Instead, at some point in the late afternoon, the group veered west and set up camp on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. Not in the valley, not in the trees. On the exposed slope, at an elevation of approximately 1,079 meters, with nothing between them and the wind but a single canvas tent. This decision has been debated for 66 years, and it remains, in my view, one of the most important details in the entire case. Not because it's mysterious, there's a perfectly reasonable explanation which I'll give you, but because the reasonable explanation doesn't survive contact with what we know about Igor Dyatlov. The standard account says the group got lost. Poor visibility, driven snow, fading daylight. They misjudged their position and ended up on the slope instead of in the valley. When they realized their error, it was too late in the day to descend safely, so they pitched the tent where they were and planned to correct course in the morning. This is plausible. It happens to experienced hikers. The mountains don't care about your credentials. But Dyatlov was not the kind of leader who pitched camp in a bad position when a better one was available downhill. His expedition logs from previous trips show a consistent pattern of conservative campsite selection. He prioritized shelter and safety over distance covered. His planning documents for this specific trip indicate he was aware of the terrain above the tree line and had specifically noted the importance of descending to the valley floor for overnight camps in exposed sections. So either Dyatlov made an uncharacteristic error in judgment, possible, certainly, no one is immune to fatigue in bad weather, or the group had a reason to be on that slope that we don't know about, something that made the exposed position acceptable. Or necessary. The official record says it was a mistake. We'll go with that for now. The tent was a large canvas structure designed for the group, roughly 4 meters long and 2 meters wide. It was pitched on a shallow platform dug into the snow, with skis planted vertically in the snow as structural supports. The entrance faced south, away from the prevailing wind. The setup was workmanlike. Not hasty, not careless, but not the kind of meticulous arrangement you'd see if they expected to stay more than one night. Inside, the group arranged their sleeping gear, stowed their equipment, and settled in for the evening. Boots were removed and placed near the entrance. Outer jackets were folded or piled. The stove, a portable wood-burning unit that the group carried specifically for heating the tent in extreme cold, was assembled but not lit. This detail is worth pausing on. It was February 1st in the northern Urals. The estimated temperature that night was somewhere between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius, with some meteorological reconstructions suggesting it may have dropped as low as -38. Wind chill would have pushed the effective temperature lower still. And the group had a stove they'd carried for exactly this purpose, a stove that represented the difference between a miserable night and a dangerous one, and they chose not to use it. Why? The most common explanation is practical. Lighting the stove required venting the tent, which meant opening a flap and allowing cold air to circulate while the fire caught. In high wind, this could be difficult and could cool the tent further before the stove generated enough heat to compensate. The group may have decided that body heat alone, combined with their sleeping bags and the insulation of the tent, was sufficient. They were tough. They were experienced. They'd slept cold before, or the stove wasn't lit because they didn't plan to sleep. Because they were going to be doing something else. I'm not going to pull that thread yet. I told you I'd give you the clean version first, and I will. The stove was assembled but not lit. They ate a meal, dried meat, crackers, some kind of grain. The remnants were found in the tent. Someone was writing in the group diary. Kolmogorova made her final entry. The tone is unremarkable. At some point, they went to sleep, or tried to. 9 people in a tent designed for 9 people? In the kind of cold where your breath freezes on the fabric above you and falls as fine ice crystals every time the wind moves the tent. It's not comfortable. It's not meant to be. The last known photograph from the expedition may have been taken that evening. It's from Krivonishenko's camera, a blurry image, poorly lit, showing what appears to be the interior of the tent, or possibly the exterior in darkness. Some analysts see the shapes of people. Some see the suggestion of a light source in the distance. Some see nothing but camera shake and underexposure. It's a Rorschach test on film, and everyone who looks at it sees the answer they were already carrying. What we know for certain is this. At some point between the late evening of February 1st and the early morning of February 2nd, something happened. And after it happened, the tent was empty. 1C, the discovery. 25 days passed. The group had been expected to send a telegram from Vijay upon completing the expedition, estimated around February 12th. When no telegram arrived, there was no immediate alarm. Delays were common, weather could slow a group by days, and communication infrastructure in the region was unreliable at the best of times. Dyatlov's own planning documents included a buffer for delays. By February 20th, however, the families began to worry. Calls were made. Inquiries were filed. On February 22nd, search parties, composed initially of volunteer hikers and students from the Institute, later supplemented by military personnel and police, were dispatched to the route. On February 26th, they found the tent. The search party that crested the ridge on Kholat Syakhl and looked down at the campsite saw, at first, what they expected to see: a tent, half collapsed, partially buried in snow. From a distance, it looked like a camp that had been abandoned in bad weather. Sagging fabric, snow accumulation, the forlorn posture of a shelter that no one was maintaining. Disappointing, but not alarming. The hikers had probably retreated to a lower elevation and were holed up somewhere in the forest, waiting out conditions. Then they got closer. The tent was not simply collapsed, it had been cut from the inside. Not one cut, several. Long slashes in the fabric, made with a blade, made with force, made by someone, or multiple someones, who wanted out of that tent now and did not care about destroying it to get there. The entrance was still laced shut. Whoever left the tent didn't use the door. They made their own. Inside, the searchers found the group's equipment: boots, jackets, packs, the stove, assembled and cold, food, cameras, axes, everything you would take with you if you were leaving a camp, and everything you would leave behind only if you had no choice or no time. The sleeping bags were present. Some appeared to have been occupied recently. Others were neatly folded. Whatever had driven the group from the tent had done so with a speed that overrode every survival instinct these experienced hikers possessed. They left without boots, in -30. That fact alone should stop you for a moment, because it stopped the searchers. These were people who understood winter, who understood that bare feet in those temperatures meant frostbite in minutes and death in hours. And they left without boots. The footprints told the next part of the story, or tried to. 8 or 9 sets of tracks led away from the tent, downhill, toward the tree line, approximately 1.5 kilometers to the northeast. The tracks were visible because a phenomenon called snow compaction had preserved them. Where the hikers stepped, their weight compressed the snow into denser columns. And when the surrounding softer snow was eroded by wind, the footprints remained as slightly raised platforms. An accident of physics that gave the searchers a trail to follow. The footprints showed several things. First, the hikers were barefoot, in socks, or wearing only light footwear. Perhaps soft indoor shoes, the kind you'd wear inside a tent but never outside it. Some prints showed 1 foot bare and 1 in a sock. Second, the tracks were orderly. The group was walking together, in a loose formation, at a steady pace. There were no signs of running, no signs of stumbling, no signs of anyone falling behind or breaking away. This is the detail that the official story presents without comment, and it's the detail that should unsettle you more than anything else I've said so far. 9 people, lightly dressed, in lethal cold, walking calmly away from their only shelter, their only equipment, their only realistic chance of survival. Walking into the dark, not running. Walking. The footprints continued downhill for approximately 1.5 kilometers before the terrain and wind conditions erased them. By that point, the trail had reached the edge of the forest, a sparse border of cedar and birch trees that marked the upper tree line. The bodies were found in 3 groups over the course of the next 3 months. The first 2 were found on February 26th, the same day as the tent. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, the 2 Yuris, were at the base of a tall cedar tree at the forest's edge, roughly 1.5 kilometers from the tent. They were wearing almost nothing. Underwear, a torn undershirt, no coats, no boots, no hats. Between them, they had attempted to build a fire. The remains of it were there, a small, pitiful thing that had clearly struggled to catch and had not burned long. The firewood consisted of green branches broken from the cedar itself, which explained the breaks on the tree's limbs. Branches had been snapped off up to 5 meters above the ground. Someone had climbed that tree in the dark, in the cold, in their underwear, and torn off branches with enough force to leave skin and flesh embedded in the bark. Both men had burns on their hands and feet. Not from the fire's warmth, from direct contact. 3rd-degree burns on their extremities, the kind you get from pushing your hands into a flame, not holding them near it. Their bodies showed the hallmarks of severe hypothermia, the mottled discoloration of skin that's lost its battle with cold, the curled posture of terminal burrowing, and, in Doroshenko's case, the removal of his outer clothing, a paradoxical undressing response that occurs in the final stages of hypothermia when the body's failing thermoregulation sends a false signal of overheating. He took off his jacket, in -30, because his dying brain told him he was too warm. They were found lying in the snow beside their inadequate fire, beneath a tree they had climbed and bled on, wearing almost nothing and burned. The clean version of the story says, they succumbed to exposure. And they did. But the clean version doesn't sit with the image of that tree long enough to feel what it means. 5 meters, in the dark, barefoot, tearing at frozen branches until your hands are raw. You don't do that to build a campfire. You do that because you need to see something. Or because you need something to see you. The next 3 bodies were found over the following days. Igor Dyatlov was discovered on March 5th, approximately 300 meters from the cedar, on the slope between the tree line and the tent. He was lying on his back, one arm raised, frozen in a posture that suggested he'd been trying to shield his face from the wind, or reaching for something. He was lightly dressed. He had made it farther back toward the tent than any of the others found at this stage, which suggests he was attempting to return, to get equipment, to get help, to get answers. He didn't make it. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found a few hundred meters closer to the tent than Dyatlov, face down in the snow, her body curled in the fetal position. She had been making the same trip, back toward the tent, back toward survival, and had fallen shorter. Her face bore an expression that the searchers described, but the official report did not dwell on. Rustem Slobodin was found between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova. He was better dressed than the others. He had a single boot, a hat, and a jacket, which suggests he either had time to grab items before leaving the tent or had received clothing from the group before they separated. His body showed signs of a struggle against the cold. His hands were clenched, his posture was stiff, and he had a fracture in his skull, a crack approximately 6 centimeters long, depressed into the bone. The official report noted the fracture and concluded it was non-fatal, meaning he could have remained conscious and mobile with this injury, possibly for some time. The cause was attributed to a fall. He slipped, struck his head, kept walking, and eventually collapsed from exposure. It's a reasonable explanation. People fall in the mountains. Head injuries are survivable. The cold does the rest. Slobodin walked several hundred meters with a cracked skull before he stopped walking. That's 5. 4 remained missing. They weren't found until May. By then, the snow had begun to melt, and a systematic search of the area around the cedar tree, using probing poles pushed deep into the snowpack, located a makeshift snow den in a ravine approximately 75 meters from the tree. Under 4 meters of snow, in a running stream of snowmelt, were the bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. They had survived the longest. They'd had the most time to think, to plan, to try. They had built a shelter. They had taken clothing from the dead at the cedar. Dubinina was wearing Krivonishenko's wool trousers. Zolotaryov had Dubinina's hat and coat. They had done everything right, and they had injuries that defied explanation. Thibaut Brignol's skull was fractured, not a hairline crack like Slobodin's, but a massive depression, as if his head had been struck by something with tremendous force. Dubinina had fractures to multiple ribs on both sides of her chest. Zolotaryov had similar chest fractures. The medical examiner, Boris Vozrozhdeny, compared the force required to cause these injuries to that of a high-speed automobile collision. The kind of impact you associate with car crashes, not with hiking accidents. But here's the detail that made Vozrozhdeny pause, and it should make you pause too. The skin was intact. There was no external trauma corresponding to the internal devastation. No bruising on the chest consistent with the broken ribs. No wound on the skull consistent with the fracture. Whatever force broke their bones did so without leaving a mark on the surface. They were crushed from the inside out. And Dubinina? Lyudmila Dubinina, the 21-year-old who'd complained about wet boots and bad jokes and the tedium of dried rations, was found with her mouth open, her face pressed into the frozen stream bed, and her tongue missing. Her eyes were gone. Her lips were partially absent. The soft tissue of her face had been removed, not torn, not gnawed, removed. The medical examiner documented this without elaboration. The official cause of death for the Ravine 4 was listed as major chest and skull injuries caused by a compelling natural force. The same phrase, the same non-answer, the same door, closed and locked with a key that was never made. The investigation continued through the spring. Witnesses were interviewed, other hikers in the region, military personnel, Mansi residents. Evidence was collected, cataloged, and filed. And on May 28, 1959, the case was formally closed. The conclusion: the group perished due to a spontaneous force which the hikers were unable to overcome. No criminal charges were filed. No further investigation was recommended. The files were sealed. For 30 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident was a rumor, a whispered story among hikers and students in the Urals. The families grieved privately. The survivors, Yudin, the families, the searchers, were left with their questions and their quiet certainty that the truth was somewhere in those files, if only someone would open them. The files were eventually opened in 1989 as the Soviet Union began its slow, ungraceful collapse. What was inside did not resolve the mystery. If anything, it deepened it. Because the files contained details that had never been made public, details that the lead investigator had been specifically instructed to remove from the official report. But that's not the clean version. The clean version ends here. 9 hikers died in the Ural Mountains in February 1959 of a compelling natural force that was never identified. Case closed. It's a tidy story, tragic but containable, the kind of thing you nod at and move on from. Shall we talk about why you shouldn't? The cracks, part 1 of 2. The details everyone ignores. So, the clean version. 9 hikers died in the mountains. Exposure, injuries, bad luck, bad weather, a compelling natural force. It's tragic, it's documented, and it should be over. It would be over if the evidence cooperated. But evidence, like snow, has a habit of preserving the things you'd rather it didn't. What I want to do now is slow down. I'm not going to introduce any theories. I'm not going to speculate about what happened. I'm simply going to walk through the physical evidence. The things that were found, cataloged, photographed, and filed, and point out the places where the official story requires you to look away. Not because the evidence is dramatic, but because it's specific. And the specific details, the ones that don't make the highlight reel, are where this case starts to feel like something other than a tragedy. They're where it starts to feel like a question. The clothing problem. Let's start with what they were wearing, or rather, what they weren't wearing, and what they were wearing that didn't belong to them. I mentioned in the official account that the hikers left the tent in minimal clothing, socks, underwear, perhaps a light undershirt. This is well established. It's the primary evidence for a sudden, overwhelming event that gave them no time to dress. But the clothing story doesn't end at the tent. It continues at the cedar, in the ravine, and across the bodies themselves. And the deeper you look at it, the stranger it gets. When the first 2 bodies were found at the cedar, Doroshenko and Krivonashenko, they were stripped to their underwear. Krivonashenko was wearing a torn undershirt and short underwear. Doroshenko had slightly more, but not much. This is consistent with terminal hypothermia. They undressed as their dying bodies told them they were overheating. Straightforward. But when the Ravine Four were found in May, they were wearing clothing that didn't belong to them. Dubinina was wearing Krivonyshenko's wool trousers, the same Krivonyshenko who was found at the cedar in his underwear. She also had a piece of his sweater wrapped around her foot. Zolotaryov was wearing Dubinina's hat and coat. Kolevatov had pieces of clothing from multiple group members. The standard survival explanation is logical and well documented in wilderness literature. They stripped clothing from the dead to improve their own chances. When Doroshenko and Krivonyshenko died at the cedar, the surviving members took what they could and continued into the ravine. This is rational behavior. This is what trained hikers do. You don't sentimentalize a dead friend's jacket when you're freezing to death. You put it on. Here's where it gets complicated. The clothing distribution doesn't perfectly map onto taken from the dead. Some items appear, based on the condition of the bodies and the configuration of the clothing, to have been exchanged before all parties involved had died. Dubinina's coat, for instance, was on Zolotaryov, but Dubinina was still alive when the ravine group reached the ravine. The forensic timeline, such as it can be reconstructed, suggests that clothing was being redistributed among living people, not just salvaged from corpses. This could mean they were triaging, deciding collectively who had the best chance of survival and concentrating resources on that person. It's grim but rational. It happens. But there's another detail that the clothing tells us, and this one rarely appears in the English language accounts of the case. Several of the garments recovered from the ravine Four tested positive for radioactive contamination, specifically beta particle radiation. Not the kind of trace amounts you'd associate with background environmental exposure. Measurable, anomalous, present on multiple garments from multiple bodies in quantities that the radiological analysis described as significantly above natural levels. I want to be precise about what was tested because precision matters here, and most accounts are sloppy with it. The contamination was found primarily on a sweater and trousers belonging to Kolevatov and on a sweater belonging to Dubinina. The testing was conducted at the request of the investigators, which means someone, at some point in the investigation, had a reason to check for radiation. You don't run a radiological analysis on hiking clothes unless something has prompted you to wonder. The official report acknowledged the contamination and offered no explanation. It noted that the garments had been in running water for months, which would have reduced any contamination from its original levels, meaning the initial exposure was likely higher than what was measured. And then, the report moved on. We'll return to the radiation. It has its own section. For now, I want you to hold two things in your mind simultaneously. The clothing that moved between bodies in patterns that don't fully make sense, and the fact that some of that clothing was radioactive. Hold them, and don't try to connect them yet. Just let them sit next to each other. There's one more clothing detail that almost never gets discussed. When the bodies were examined, several of them displayed a peculiar discoloration of the skin, described in the autopsy reports as a deep orange-brown tan. Not the lividity you'd expect from decomposition. Not sunburn, though the investigators initially considered it. A distinct, unnatural darkening of the skin that was present on exposed areas of the face and hands. The medical examiner documented it. He did not explain it. In his notes, he used the Russian phrase that translates roughly to deep brown-orange color of the soft tissues, and his clinical tone suggests he found it noteworthy but outside his expertise. Subsequent researchers have offered various explanations: UV exposure at altitude, chemical exposure, or a side effect of certain types of radiation. None has been confirmed. The skin color of the dead is not a detail that makes it into most retellings of this case. It's not dramatic. It doesn't suggest a villain or a weapon. It's just wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't fit any of the standard explanations comfortably, so it gets filed under miscellaneous and forgotten. I don't think it should be forgotten. The tent problem. The tent was cut from the inside. This is the single most famous detail of the Dyatlov Pass case, the one that launches every retelling and anchors every theory. And because it's so well known, most people think they understand it. They don't. Because the tent tells a more complicated story then they panicked and cut their way out. Let's start with what we know. The tent was a large, custom-made canvas structure sewn together from two smaller tents to accommodate the full group. It was found on February 26th, 25 days after the group's last diary entry, partially collapsed and covered in snow. Examination revealed multiple cuts in the fabric, primarily on the side facing the slope, the uphill side. Now, here's the first detail that gets overlooked: the orientation of the tent. Dyatlov pitched the tent with the entrance facing downhill, away from the prevailing wind. This is standard mountain camping practice. You want the wind hitting the back of the tent, not blowing through the door. But it also means that when the group cut their way out, they cut through the uphill wall. They didn't go toward the entrance. They went out the back, toward the slope, toward whatever was above them. Think about that geometry for a moment. If you're panicking and you want out, the fastest route is the door. It was laced shut, yes, but unlacing takes seconds. You could even tear through the lacing faster than you could draw a knife and cut canvas. The group didn't go for the door. They cut through the heavy fabric on the opposite side, the side facing uphill, the side where they'd have to climb over the tent's structural supports to exit, unless they were trying to get away from something that was between them and the entrance. Something downhill. Something at the door. Or, and this is the reading that some Russian forensic analysts have proposed, they weren't trying to get out. They were trying to get to something they could see through the fabric, something uphill on the slope that required immediate access. The knife cuts themselves are more revealing than most accounts acknowledge. Forensic analysis conducted on the tent fabric, not in 1959 but decades later, by independent researchers who obtained access to the preserved material, identified characteristics of the cuts that suggest they were made by at least two different people, from at least two different positions inside the tent. Some cuts originate from a low position, as if someone was lying down or kneeling. Others originate from higher up, standing or crouching height. And they were made simultaneously, or nearly so, based on the overlapping patterns of the incisions. Two people cutting at the same time from different postures. That's not panic, that's coordinated response. You don't coordinate with someone in the dark in a confined space in the grip of terror. You coordinate when you've made a decision, when there's a plan, even if the plan is desperate. But here's where the tent gets genuinely strange. Some of the cuts appear to have been made from the outside. I need to be careful with this claim, because it's contested. The 1959 investigation concluded that all cuts were made from within. Subsequent analysis, particularly work done by Russian researchers Bayanov and Slobtsov in the 2000s, agreed that the primary cuts were internal. But a smaller number of incisions, particularly near the base of the tent on the uphill side, show characteristics more consistent with external cutting. The angle of the blade entry, the direction of the fabric distortion, the fraying pattern. It's not definitive. Fabric forensics on 60-year-old canvas is not an exact science. But the possibility that someone, or something, was cutting into the tent from outside while the group was cutting out from inside is one of those details that sits in the case file like a splinter. And then there's the missing section. When the tent was recovered and cataloged, the investigators noted that a portion of the fabric was absent, not torn away. The edges of the remaining material showed cut marks, suggesting the missing section had been deliberately removed. No corresponding fragment of tent fabric was found at the site, on the trail, at the cedar, or in the ravine. It simply wasn't there. Was it removed by the hikers? Was it taken by the group to use as insulation or a wind barrier during their descent to the tree line? Possible. But no one in the group was found with tent fabric on them or near them. Was it removed by the investigators? Possibly. Evidence handling in 1959 was not what it is today, and items went missing from the case file with frustrating regularity. Was it removed by someone else? The official report does not address the missing section. It's noted in the evidence inventory as an absence and never mentioned again. A hole in the record, in the shape of a hole in the tent. One more thing about the tent that I want you to sit with. Among the items found inside was the group's expedition newspaper, a handwritten satirical newsletter they'd titled Evening o Torten, a play on the Soviet tradition of evening newspapers. It was a group project. Jokes, drawings, commentary on the trip, teasing references to group members. The tone is lighthearted. The humor is the specific, insular humor of close friends on a long trip. You had to be there jokes about bad skiing and someone's terrible cooking. The Evening o Torten was dated February 1st, the same day they made camp on Kholat Syakhl, the same evening, possibly the same hours, before whatever happened, happened. The content of the newsletter shows no anxiety, no awareness of danger, no hint that anything was wrong. They were writing jokes, they were drawing cartoons of each other, they were being 22-year-olds on a camping trip, and then they were dead. The juxtaposition of the Evening o Torten with the slashed tent is, I think, the single most unsettling detail in the entire case. Not because it reveals anything, but because it reveals the speed of the transition, from laughter to flight. From cartoons to barefoot in the snow. Whatever happened didn't build. It didn't warn. It arrived. The cedar tree. We talked about the cedar in the official story. The tall tree at the edge of the forest where Doroshenko and Krivonishenko were found, where branches were broken up to 5 meters high, where a fire was started and failed. But the clean version of the cedar is a sketch. Let me fill it in. The cedar was a landmark-sized tree, large enough to climb, visible from a distance, the kind of solitary giant that stands out at a tree line. The group would have seen it from the slope during their descent. It's likely they were aiming for it. In the dark, in the snow, with limited visibility, a large tree at the forest edge would be the most obvious navigational target. Head for the big tree, start a fire, survive until morning. The two Uras arrived at the cedar and did exactly what training would dictate. They began building a fire, but the fire was a disaster, and not just because of the cold. The branches they broke from the cedar were green wood, living timber. Green wood doesn't burn well under the best conditions. In extreme cold with no accelerant, it barely burns at all. The fire they built was small, smoky, and short-lived. The charred remains suggest it burned for perhaps 30 minutes to an hour before dying. The question that no one has satisfactorily answered is, why didn't they gather dead wood? The forest floor around the cedar, even in February, would have had fallen branches, dead timber, dry kindling. Not in abundance, but enough to sustain a fire longer than green branches torn from a living tree. The two Uras either didn't look for dead wood, couldn't look for it, or weren't primarily interested in building a fire. The broken branches may have served a different purpose, or a dual purpose. Here's the detail that reframes the cedar. The breaks extend to 5 meters. That's over 16 feet. The lower branches, the ones you could reach from the ground or with a short climb, were broken off, yes. But someone continued climbing well beyond the practical height for gathering firewood, and continued breaking branches at a height where the effort required was enormous, and the risk of falling was severe. Their hands were shredded. Tissue was found embedded in the bark at multiple heights. They climbed until their bodies failed. From 5 meters up that cedar, on a clear night, you would have a partial line of sight back up the slope to the location of the tent. You could see the ridge, you could see the approach. Were they watching? Some researchers have proposed that the two Uras climbed the tree, not for firewood, but for observation, trying to see what was happening at the tent, or what was coming down the slope toward them. The fire in this reading was a secondary concern, a signal perhaps, or an attempt at one. The burns on their hands and feet take on a different quality in this context. Not the accidental contact of hypothermic men losing their coordination near a fire, but the desperate reaching of people who needed that fire to stay visible, to be seen, by the others, by anyone. There's physical evidence that supports the observation theory, though it's circumstantial. The snow around the base of the cedar was disturbed in a pattern consistent with more activity than two men building a fire. Multiple tracks, movement around the tree's base in different directions, areas of compacted snow that suggest people were standing and watching, rather than just working. The searchers noted this disturbance, but attributed it to the fire-building effort. Maybe they were right. But there's also the matter of the melted snow. Beneath and around the cedar, the search party noted an area of snowmelt that was larger than the fire could reasonably account for. The fire was small, struggled to stay lit, and was built from green wood. It would not have generated significant radiant heat. Yet the melted area extended beyond the fire's perimeter by a noticeable margin. This observation was included in the search party's initial report and was not addressed in the official investigation. What generates heat without flame? Friction, decomposition, chemical reaction, electrical discharge, and certain types of radiation. Or more prosaically, a much larger fire that burned before the search party arrived and left no trace other than the melt pattern. None of these explanations is satisfying. None of them has been confirmed. The cedar holds one final detail that I've never seen given the weight it deserves. When the two Urals were found at its base, their bodies showed a specific pattern of clothing removal that is consistent with paradoxical undressing, the hypothermia-induced delusion of warmth. But the sequence of removal was odd. Normally, a person experiencing paradoxical undressing removes outer layers first, then progressively strips inward. It's systematic, in a deranged sort of way, because the body's false signal is, I'm overheating, and you respond the way you'd respond to real overheating. Take off the jacket, then the sweater, then the shirt. Doroshenko and Krivonashenko had removed clothing, but some items appeared to have been cut off rather than removed normally. Fabric was torn. Seams were split. This could be explained by the clumsiness of hypothermic hands. You can't work buttons or zippers when your fingers are frozen, so you tear. But it could also suggest that the clothing was removed by someone else. Someone who was alive, and who needed those garments more than the dead did. If the other survivors came back to the cedar after Doroshenko and Krivonashenko died, and the evidence suggests they did because the Ravine Four were wearing their clothes, then the scene at the cedar tree was not just a failed campfire. It was a triage point, a place where the living returned to the dead, stripped them, and moved on. In the dark, in the cold, among friends whose faces they recognized and whose clothes they were now wearing. The cedar tree is not a footnote. It's the crossroads of the entire case. Everything that happened after the tent converges here, and everything that happened after the cedar diverges into the three groups of the dead. The two Urals at the base, the three on the slope, the four in the ravine. Whatever decisions were made at this tree determined who lived longest, who died where, and what they were wearing when it finally ended. And somewhere in the branches, 5 meters up, in the bark scarred by desperate hands, is the trace of someone who climbed as high as they could and looked back toward the tent. I wonder what they saw. The things that got filed away. There's a dividing line in the Dyatlov Pass case, and we've just crossed it. Everything I've discussed so far, the clothing, the tent, the cedar, is physical evidence. Things you can touch. Things that were found, photographed, measured, and entered into the record. You can argue about what they mean, but you can't argue that they exist. What comes next is different. Not because the evidence is less real. It's in the files, it was documented, it was observed by qualified professionals, but because some of it was deliberately suppressed. Removed from the official report on orders from above, noted by the investigators and then unnoted, as if the act of writing something down could be reversed by the act of pretending you hadn't. The details I'm about to describe weren't discovered by conspiracy theorists or internet sleuths. They were discovered by the people who investigated the case, recorded in their working notes, and then excluded from the final document that the Soviet government sealed for 30 years. When the files were opened in 1989, the working notes were still there. The margins were still full. And the things written in those margins changed the shape of the case entirely. The tongue I need to talk about Lyudmila Dubinina's tongue. I don't particularly want to, because this detail has been so sensationalized over the decades that serious researchers tend to flinch when it comes up. It's become the case's grotesque calling card, the detail that gets whispered at parties, the one that horror podcasts lead with, the one that makes people's eyes go wide. And that sensationalism has, ironically, made it harder to see clearly, because when something becomes a spectacle, you stop examining it, you just react to it. So, let's not react. Let's examine. Dubinina was one of the Ravine 4, found in May under 4 meters of snow, partially submerged in a running stream of snowmelt. She had been dead for approximately 3 months. Her body showed the catastrophic rib fractures I described earlier, bilateral, multiple, inflicted by a force the medical examiner compared to a car crash. Those injuries alone would have been the focus of any normal autopsy. But Dubinina's body presented an additional finding that the medical examiner, Boris Vozrozhdeny, documented with a clinical precision that somehow makes it worse. Her tongue was absent, not damaged, not partially present. Absent. The entire organ, including the tip, the body, and the root, along with the floor of her mouth and a portion of the upper lip, was gone. Her eyes were also absent, both orbital cavities were empty, and sections of the soft tissue of her face, particularly around the mouth and nose, showed the same condition. Not decomposed, not gnawed, but missing. As if something had performed a selective, almost surgical removal of specific structures from her head. The standard explanation, and the one that most medical professionals will give you if you ask, is straightforward: decomposition and scavenger activity. Dubinina was found in running water. 3 months in a cold stream will do extraordinary things to soft tissue. The tongue, being a muscular organ connected by relatively delicate attachment points, is among the first structures to decompose in aquatic environments. The eyes, similarly, are soft and exposed. Small scavengers, fish, crustaceans, insects in warmer periods, will target the softest, most accessible tissues first. There's nothing inherently mysterious about a body in water losing its tongue and eyes. It happens. The biology is well understood. And if the explanation stopped there, I'd accept it and move on. But there are details in Vozrozhdeny's autopsy report that complicate the picture, and these details are the ones that rarely make it into the English language accounts. Partly because the full autopsy report wasn't widely translated until relatively recently, and partly because the details are technical enough that summarizers tend to skip them. First, the hyoid bone. This is a small, horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that serves as an anchor point for the tongue muscles. In cases where the tongue is lost to decomposition or scavenger activity, the hyoid is typically still present. Because it's bone, it resists the processes that destroy soft tissue. Dubinina's hyoid was intact. That's consistent with the standard explanation. But the condition of the hyoid is the detail that matters. In decomposition, the muscles that attach to the hyoid degrade gradually, and the bone shows a characteristic pattern of soft tissue recession around its attachment points. In Dubinina's case, Vozrozhdeny noted that the tissue separation at the hyoid was, and I'm translating his clinical terminology as precisely as I can, clean. He used a word that in Russian forensic medical language connotes a separation that is sharp rather than gradual, not torn, not rotted, separated. Does this prove anything? No. Forensic pathology in 1959 was not what it is today, and Vozrozhdeny was working with a body in poor condition in a provincial morgue. His terminology may have been imprecise. His observations may have been colored by the unusual circumstances. But his choice of language has been noted by modern forensic specialists who've reviewed the report, and several have commented that clean separation is an atypical description for decomposition-related tissue loss. Second, the pattern of absence. Decomposition and scavenger activity are by their nature messy. They don't select. They don't discriminate between adjacent tissues. If fish or insects consumed the tongue and eyes, you'd expect corresponding damage to the surrounding structures: the cheeks, the gums, the ear cartilage, the remaining nasal tissue. Some of these structures did show damage on Dubinina, but the damage was described as less severe and of a different character than the loss of the tongue and eyes. Vozrozhdeny documented this asymmetry without interpreting it, which is perhaps the most interesting thing he did. A medical examiner who believed the explanation was simple decomposition would have said so. Vozrozhdeny described what he saw and moved on. Third, and this is the detail that gets ignored most consistently because it's not about Dubinina at all. Zolotaryov, found in the same ravine, was documented as having his mouth open. Not slack, open. The facial musculature was fixed in a position of extreme mouth opening, consistent with a facial expression that was established at or very near the time of death, and then frozen in place. Vozrozhdeny noted this as well in the same clinical register, without interpretation, a mouth fixed open at death. There are several possible explanations. The person was screaming. The person was gasping, the agonal breathing that sometimes accompanies death by chest compression, which Zolotaryov's crushed ribs would certainly have produced. The person was choking. The person was vomiting. Or the person was experiencing something that caused an involuntary oral response of a type that the medical examiner chose not to speculate about. Now, I want to connect two things that are typically discussed separately. Dubinina's tongue was missing. Zolotaryov, lying near her in the same ravine, died with his mouth fixed open. These two details are in the same autopsy series documented by the same examiner in the same time period, and yet they are almost never discussed together. Dubinina's tongue goes in the grotesque mystery file. Zolotaryov's mouth goes in the physical evidence file. They don't meet. I'm not going to make them meet. I'm just going to point out that they were found 75 meters from the cedar in a ravine within arm's reach of each other, and one of them was missing the organ of speech, and the other's face was frozen in the shape of using it. That's not a theory. It's a juxtaposition. Make of it what you will. The radiation. Let's talk about what shouldn't have been on their clothes. I mentioned earlier that several garments recovered from the ravine, 4 tested positive for beta particle radiation. This detail is widely known among Dyatlov researchers, but the context of how and why the testing was conducted is less well understood, and the context changes the weight of the finding considerably. Radiological testing was not standard procedure in Soviet death investigations. It wasn't standard procedure anywhere in 1959. You didn't run a Geiger counter over a hiker's sweater unless you had a specific reason to believe radiation was involved. So the question is not just, why were the clothes radioactive? The question is, why did someone think to check? The answer, as best as can be reconstructed from the case files and subsequent interviews, involves a chain of observations that the investigators made and then were told to unmake. During the recovery of the bodies, multiple members of the search and investigation teams noted the unusual skin discoloration I described earlier, the orange-brown coloring on the faces and hands of the dead. This discoloration, combined with the absence of expected decomposition patterns in some areas and the unusual tissue damage in others, prompted the lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, to request a radiological analysis. It was not his first instinct. It was a decision he made after the physical evidence led him there. The testing was conducted on clothing from Kolevatov's sweater and trousers and on Dubinina's sweater. All 3 garments showed beta radiation levels significantly above background. The specific readings, as recorded in the working notes, indicated contamination in the range of, and I want to be precise here because the numbers matter and they're often misreported, approximately 5,000 to 9,900 counts per minute for certain sections of the garments. Background levels for uncontaminated clothing of similar material would typically register in the range of a few hundred counts per minute. These are not lethal levels. They are not levels that would cause acute radiation sickness. But they are dramatically above what you would expect to find on the clothing of civilian hikers in the Ural Mountains in 1959 or any other year. The critical additional detail: the garments had been in running water for approximately 3 months before recovery. Water is an effective decontaminant for beta particle radiation. It washes away surface-deposited radioactive material. The levels measured on the recovered clothing represent what remained after 3 months of natural decontamination. The original contamination, whatever it was, wherever it came from, would have been substantially higher. So, where did it come from? There are 3 standard explanations, and none of them is fully satisfying. The first is fallout. The Soviet Union was actively conducting nuclear weapons tests in the late 1950s, including atmospheric tests that deposited fallout across wide swaths of northern Russia. It's possible that residual fallout was present in the environment at Kholat Syakhl, in the snow, the soil, the water, and was picked up by the hiker's clothing through normal contact. The problem with this explanation is specificity. Fallout contamination would be uniform. It would be on all the clothing, not just certain garments. And it would be at consistent low-level background readings, not the elevated counts that were actually measured. The second is occupational exposure. Krivonashenko had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility. He had been involved in cleanup operations after the 1957 Kyshtym disaster, one of the most significant nuclear accidents in Soviet history. He was almost certainly exposed to radiation during that work. If his clothing retained residual contamination, and this is plausible, given that decontamination protocols in the 1950s were nothing like what they'd become later, then the garments that the Ravine 4 took from his body at the Cedar could have carried that contamination with them. This is the most rational explanation. It accounts for the presence of radiation on specific garments rather than all of them. It explains why the contamination was on clothes that had been transferred from one person to another. And it requires no exotic explanation. Just a young man who worked at a nuclear facility and carried traces of it on his clothes for the rest of his short life. But there's a problem. The highest contamination readings were on Kolovatov's clothing, not on garments that had been Krivonashenko's. Kolovatov's own sweater and trousers showed the most elevated readings, and Kolovatov had no documented connection to nuclear work. He did, however, have a connection to the Sverdlovsk Physics Institute, a facility whose exact research focus in the late 1950s has never been fully clarified. Kolovatov's transfer from this institute to the Ural Polytechnic is one of those biographical details I mentioned earlier that contains a gap, a seam that doesn't quite line up. The third explanation is direct exposure on the mountain. Something at or near Kholat Syakhl was a source of radiation, and the hikers came into contact with it. This is the explanation that raises the most alarming questions and produces the fewest satisfying answers, because it requires you to identify a radiation source in a wilderness area with no documented nuclear facilities, unless there were undocumented ones, or mobile ones, or temporary ones. Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator, included the radiological findings in his working report. He was then instructed by superiors in Moscow, according to his own later testimony, to remove them from the final version. He was told in language he later described as unambiguous that the radiation findings were to be excluded from the case file. He complied. He also, in those same working notes that survived the redaction, recorded something else he was told to remove. Multiple witness reports from other hiking groups in the Ural region, from military observers, from Mansi residents, of luminous spheres in the sky over the northern Urals on the nights of February 1st and 2nd, 1959. Bright, moving, silent objects that were observed by independent witnesses at different locations over a period of several hours. Ivanov was told to remove the radiation. He was told to remove the lights. He was told to close the case and file it under compelling natural force. And he did all of these things because in 1959 in the Soviet Union, you did what Moscow told you to do. But he kept his working notes, and he kept his questions. And 30 years later, when keeping quiet was no longer mandatory, he talked. We'll hear what he said in a later section. For now, I want you to hold this. The lead investigator found radiation on the bodies and lights in the sky, and he was ordered to pretend he hadn't. The photographs. The group carried several cameras on the expedition. This was normal. Photography was a common hobby among Soviet students, and documenting an expedition was both a personal memento and an institutional requirement. The recovered cameras contained dozens of photographs, most of which are exactly what you'd expect. Trail shots, group portraits, scenic views, the visual diary of a winter hiking trip. But two photographic details break the pattern, and both involve cameras that were where they shouldn't have been. The first is frame 34 on Krivonashenko's camera, the last exposure on the roll. The image is blurry, poorly lit, and has been the subject of more analysis and argument than any other single photograph in the case. It appears to show a dark background, night sky or the interior of the tent, with a bright, slightly elongated shape in the frame. The shape has been interpreted as everything from a campfire reflection on the camera lens, to a distant light source in the sky, to a human figure, to a pure camera malfunction. What makes frame 34 significant isn't what it shows, it's when it was taken. The exposure characteristics and the position of the frame on the film roll indicate it was shot after the other expedition photographs, likely at night, and possibly, though not certainly, after the group left the tent. If someone came back to the tent, retrieved the camera, and took a single photograph of something in the dark before fleeing again, frame 34 is the result. Or the camera was accidentally triggered during the chaos of the tent evacuation. Or the frame is a light leak from the roll being improperly advanced. The technical explanations exist. They're reasonable. They just don't feel reasonable when you look at that frame in sequence after the smiling trail photos, because the visual language of the image is so different from everything that came before it. The other photos say, "We are here and we are alive." Frame 34 says something else entirely. But frame 34 is famous. It's been analyzed, enhanced, debated, and published in every major account of the case. The second photographic anomaly is less well known, and I think it's more important. Semyon Zolotaryov was found in the ravine with a camera around his neck. Not in his pack, not in the tent with the others, on his body. Hung around his neck on its strap, pressed against his crushed chest, carried through the flight from the tent, the descent to the cedar, the trek to the ravine, and the final hours of his life. Think about what that means. When the group fled the tent in their underwear, without boots, without coats, without any of the equipment that could have kept them alive, Zolotaryov, a 38-year-old military veteran who certainly understood the priorities of a survival situation, grabbed his camera. Not a jacket, not boots, not the stovepipe, a camera. And he didn't drop it. Through the cold, the dark, the walk, the descent, the construction of the snow den, the onset of the injuries that would kill him, he kept it. Most people, in the grip of mortal fear, grab the thing that will keep them alive. Zolotaryov grabbed the thing that would keep a record. That's not a survival instinct. That's a documentation instinct. It's the behavior of a person who believed that what was happening needed to be seen by someone who wasn't there. Or, and this is the thread that connects Zolotaryov's camera to everything else that's strange about Zolotaryov, it's the behavior of a person whose purpose on that mountain was observation, whose real reason for joining the expedition wasn't the hike. Zolotaryov's camera was recovered from his body. The film inside it was severely damaged by water and time. Some frames have been partially recovered through modern restoration techniques, but the results are inconclusive. Shapes, shadows, possible contours that could be anything or nothing. If Zolotaryov photographed what happened in those final hours, the images may still exist on that film, degraded beyond current recovery methods. Or they may not. The film has been in the possession of the Dyatlov Foundation and Russian authorities at various points over the decades, and its chain of custody is not as clean as you'd want it to be for a piece of evidence this potentially significant. There is one more photographic detail that belongs here, and it's one I've never seen given proper attention. The group's cameras were found, and their film was developed as part of the investigation. But the developed photographs were not all included in the case file. The investigators selected the images they considered relevant and excluded the rest. The excluded photographs, considered mundane, redundant, or irrelevant, were filed separately and received minimal attention. Among those excluded photographs are several frames that show the group at rest stops and campsites before the final night. In at least two of these images, identified by researchers who gained access to the full photographic archive decades later, there appear to be additional sets of ski tracks in the background. Tracks that don't belong to the group. Tracks that suggest someone else had been in the area, on the same trails, in the same time frame. The investigators noted the tracks in the photos. They attributed them to Mansi hunters or other hikers in the region. They did not investigate further. The photographs were filed and forgotten. Someone else was in those mountains. Probably it was no one of consequence. Probably it means nothing. Probably. I want to return to Yuri Yudin, not to his grief, I've described that, and I don't want to exploit it. I want to return to his analysis, because Yudin spent 54 years studying this case, and the conclusions he reached are not the ones that most people associate with him. Yudin is usually presented in Dyatlov narratives as the tragic survivor, the man who turned back, the one who lived, the walking embodiment of there but for the grace of God. And he was that. But he was also, by the end of his life, one of the most methodical and relentless investigators the case had. He read every document. He visited the site. He corresponded with researchers across the world. He interrogated the evidence with the patience of a man who had nothing left to lose by asking uncomfortable questions. And the question he kept coming back to, the one that anchored his thinking for decades, was not what happened. It was where. Yudin was convinced that the key to the case lay in the campsite location, not in the events of the night, but in the decision to camp on the slope of Kholat Syakhl in the first place. He returned to this point in interview after interview with increasing insistence, as if he could see something in the geography that everyone else was overlooking. His argument was straightforward. The group's route log, the document Dyatlov filed with the sports club before departure, specifying their planned path, did not match the route they actually took. The deviation was small, a few kilometers, an adjustment that could easily be attributed to weather, navigation error, or a spontaneous decision to explore a variant path. But Yudin didn't believe it was spontaneous. He believed the deviation was deliberate, that the group, or someone in the group, intended to go to the slope of Kholat Syakhl, that the campsite wasn't a mistake, it was a destination. Why would anyone deviate from a planned route to camp on an exposed, windswept slope above the tree line when a sheltered valley with forest cover was available less than a kilometer downhill? Yudin had a theory, and it evolved over time, but its core remained consistent. The group was shown something, or told about something, that made the slope a point of interest. He suspected, though he could never prove it, that Zolotaryov had information about the area that the rest of the group did not. That Zolotaryov's late addition to the expedition was not coincidental. That the man with the unclear military background and the personal camera had a reason to be on that specific mountain on that specific night. Yudin was careful to distinguish between what he knew and what he suspected. He knew the route deviated. He knew the campsite was illogical. He knew Zolotaryov was an outsider. He suspected that these facts were connected, and that the connection explained not just where the group camped, but why something happened to them there. He never found the proof. He looked for 54 years, and the proof was either never there or was removed before he could find it. There's one more Yudin detail that I want to leave you with, because it's the kind of thing that sits in the back of your mind and won't leave. At the trailhead, on January 28th, when Yudin turned back due to his leg pain, he said goodbye to each member of the group individually. He embraced them, he took a photograph, and then he exchanged a few items with Dyatlov. Small things, the kind of practical trading that hikers do when one person is leaving and another is continuing. Yudin gave Dyatlov some items he no longer needed. Dyatlov gave Yudin some items that were too heavy to justify carrying further. Among the items Dyatlov gave Yudin were some geological samples, rocks the group had collected along the route. Yudin, who had an interest in geology, accepted them. He put them in his pack and went home. Decades later, when Yudin examined those rocks as part of his ongoing investigation, he realized that some of them did not come from the geological formations along the group's planned route. They came from formations that would only have been accessible if the group had deviated from their planned path. Specifically, they came from an area near Kholat Syakhl. The group had been collecting rocks from a place they weren't supposed to be. Yudin noted this. He published it. It was discussed in research circles, and then, like so many details in this case, it drifted to the margins. It wasn't dramatic enough to compete with missing tongues and luminous spheres. It was just a handful of rocks that came from the wrong place. The kind of detail that only matters if you're the kind of person who believes the small things are where the truth hides. Yudin was that kind of person. By the end, it was all he had left. There are more cracks. There are always more cracks in a case like this. Every time you think you found the last one, you turn the page and there's another line in the margin, another measurement that doesn't match, another witness statement that was taken and then withdrawn. I could continue. I could spend another hour in the crevices of the evidence, pulling out details that don't fit the official story, and laying them end to end until the weight of them becomes its own kind of argument. But I think you see the shape of it now. The shape of a case where every answer requires you to ignore something, where the evidence doesn't contradict the conclusion so much as exceed it. There's always more than the explanation can hold, and the overflow is where the discomfort lives. So let's do something different now. Let's stop cataloging what was found and start imagining what it felt like. Not for the investigators, not for the researchers, for the 9 people on that mountain in that tent on that night. Let's go back to February 1st. Let's go inside. Reconstruction, what they experienced before they died. I want to try something different now. Everything I've told you so far has been in the past tense, forensic, analytical, the language of someone reading a file, and that's appropriate. This is a case, and cases live in the past, in the evidence, in the record of what was found, and when, and by whom. That's the responsible way to discuss it. But there are limits to what the past tense can tell you. It can tell you what happened. It can't tell you what it felt like. And the Dyatlov past case is at its core a story about 9 people who experienced something that took them from safety to death in a span of hours. And the past tense keeps that experience at arm's length. It lets you think about it without being in it. I'd like to close that distance, just for a while. Not because I know what happened, I don't, and neither does anyone else alive. But because the physical evidence, the forensic timeline, and the environmental conditions allow us to reconstruct with reasonable confidence what the experience would have been like. Not the cause, the sensation, the texture of those hours, what the cold felt like, what the dark looked like, what decisions were made, and what it cost to make them. This is speculative. I want to be honest about that. But it's speculation constrained by evidence. Every detail I describe is grounded in something that was found, measured, or documented. I'm not inventing, I'm inhabiting. It's February 1st, it's evening, and we're going inside the tent. Inside. It's sometime after dinner, maybe 8 o'clock, maybe 9. The light has been gone for hours in the northern Urals in February. The sun sets before 5 in the afternoon, and after that, the world simplifies into 2 things: the dark and the cold. The tent is both a refuge from and a container for these things. It keeps the wind out, mostly, but it doesn't keep the cold out. And in the darkness, the only light comes from a candle or a small lantern, and the ghostly ambient glow of snow, reflecting whatever fractional starlight or moonlight makes it through the cloud cover. 9 people are inside. The tent is roughly 4 meters by 2 meters. That's 8 square meters for 9 bodies plus their gear. Their sleeping bags, their packs, the disassembled stove, the food stores, the cameras, the axes, the notebooks. It is, by any standard, tight. You don't move without bumping someone. You don't turn over without negotiating with the person next to you. The air smells like wet wool, dried sweat, canvas, and the faint metallic note of extreme cold. That particular smell that isn't really a smell at all, but a sensation in the sinuses that tells you the air is trying to freeze the moisture inside your nose. Someone is writing. The last diary entry. The tone is mundane. The group had a long day, poor visibility, route adjustments, the grind of breaking trail through fresh snow with full packs. They're tired. The kind of tired where your muscles feel like they've been replaced with something heavier and less cooperative. But it's a familiar tired, an earned tired. The tired of people who are doing what they came to do. Someone else is working on the Evening Otorten, the satirical newsletter. There are jokes being composed, probably bad ones. The specific, recursive humor of a group that's been together for days and has worn through the outer layers of conversation into the private nonsense underneath. Inside jokes about inside jokes. Someone draws a cartoon. Someone else makes a comment that's funnier to the 6 people who get the reference than it would be to anyone else on Earth. The stove sits assembled but unlit. This detail. It sits in the corner of the tent like a character in a play who never speaks, but whose presence changes the meaning of every scene. The stove is their defense against the cold. It represents the difference between discomfort and danger, and they've chosen not to use it. Maybe because the wind makes it impractical. Maybe because they're warm enough in their sleeping bags and don't want to bother with the ventilation process. Maybe because they're planning to do something later that requires the tent to be dark, or cold, or both. The temperature outside is somewhere between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius. Inside the tent, body heat and insulation bring it up marginally, maybe to -15, maybe to -10. Still cold enough that your breath condenses and freezes on the tent fabric above you, forming a thin layer of frost that sheds fine ice crystals every time the wind flexes the canvas. You learn to sleep under this. You learn to ignore the tiny cold pinpricks on your face. You learn a lot of things when you've been winter camping for a week. They settle in. Sleeping bags are occupied. Boots are off, placed near the entrance where they'll be accessible in the morning. Coats and outer layers are folded or bundled, used as pillows or extra insulation. The small rituals of bedtime in a space where bedtime isn't a transition from waking to sleeping so much as a transition from vertical to horizontal in the same cold room. The wind is constant. Not a gale, not yet, but steady. A low, persistent pressure against the tent fabric that makes the canvas move. In and out, in and out. If you've spent time in a tent in high wind, you know this rhythm. It sounds like breathing, not yours, the tent's. A slow, organic pulse that you stop noticing after a while, the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. Unless something changes. I don't know what time it is when something changes. The forensic estimate, based on the digestive state of their last meal and the timeline of events that follows, places it somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. Let's say it's late. Let's say most of them are asleep, or in that shallow, cold, interrupted half-sleep that passes for rest in these conditions. 1 or 2 might still be awake, the ones who always take longer to drift off, the ones whose minds are still working through tomorrow's route, the ones who are listening to the wind and the tent breathing and the small sounds of 8 other people in a very small space. Something happens. The moment I can't tell you what it is. Nobody can. The evidence tells us the consequences of this moment with extraordinary clarity, but the moment itself is a void, a black space in the center of the case that every theory tries to fill and none succeeds. What I can tell you is what the consequences looked like. Multiple people begin cutting the tent. Not one person, multiple. From different positions, simultaneously, or nearly so. This is coordinated. Someone on the left side of the tent, low, kneeling, or lying down, puts a blade to the canvas and slashes. Someone else, farther right, higher up, does the same. The fabric gives way with a sound, and here I want you to hold this because this sound is going to come back. A sound like tearing, not sharp, not clean, a ripping, fibrous resistance, and then release. Over and over. They're not cutting an exit, they're cutting exits. Multiple openings, as if each person is making their own way out rather than waiting for a single hole to climb through. The urgency of this is difficult to overstate. The tent is their shelter. It's the only thing between them and an environment that will kill them in hours. And they are destroying it with knives, deliberately, rapidly, without discussion, because in the time it would take to discuss it, whatever is happening will have progressed to a point where discussion is no longer relevant. They go through the cuts, into the night, into -30, in what they're wearing, which for most of them is long underwear or less. No boots, no coats, no hats, no gloves. Their feet hit the snow and the cold enters them through the soles like electricity. A pain so immediate and so total that it stops being pain almost instantly and becomes something else. A signal, a reorganization of priorities. Every nerve in the body reclassifying what matters. They stand. 9 people, or perhaps 8, the exact count of the footprints has been debated, standing on a Russian mountainside in the dead of winter in their underwear. The wind is hitting their exposed skin with a force that carries the cold deeper than the surface. It's inside them now, in their lungs with every breath, a searing, ice crystal inhalation that makes the chest contract involuntarily, a gasp reflex that the body can't override. and they look around. I want you to imagine what they see, or rather what they don't see. Because the northern Urals in February, at 1 or 2 in the morning, under cloud cover in blowing snow, are not dark the way a room is dark. They're dark the way a blindfold is dark, a darkness that has texture, that pushes against your eyes, that makes you question whether your eyes are open. There's snow on the ground, which provides a faint ambient brightness, a gray-white luminosity that gives you shapes, but not details. You can see the outline of the person next to you. You can see the bulk of the tent behind you, sinking now through its slashes, deflating like a wounded thing. You can see the slope falling away below you toward a darkness that's denser than the darkness around it. The tree line. The forest. Shelter, they walk. This is the part that undoes me every time I read the case file. They walk. The footprints are clear on this point. The group moved downhill toward the tree line at a steady, measured pace, in formation, together, not running, not stumbling, walking. As if they've made a decision, collectively, silently, in that impossible moment of standing barefoot in a killing cold, and the decision is, we go down. We go to the trees. We go now, and we go together, and we do not go back. Whatever was in that tent, or approaching that tent, or above that tent, or happening to that tent, was worse than this. Worse than the certainty of frostbite. Worse than the probability of death by exposure. These are experienced winter hikers. They know the math. They know that naked skin in -30 has minutes before the damage begins and hours before it becomes irreversible. They know that leaving their boots and coats and sleeping bags behind is a decision that will almost certainly kill them. And they make it anyway. 1.5 kilometers, roughly a mile, in the snow, barefoot, in the dark, in the wind. It takes them, let's estimate, 30 to 45 minutes. The cold is working on them the entire time. Feet that went numb in the first 5 minutes are now insensate blocks that they're walking on through proprioception alone, feeling the ground not through their soles, but through the pressure in their ankles and knees. Hands that were tucked against their bodies are cramping, the fine motor control dissolving as the blood retreats from the extremities to protect the core. Faces are stiffening. Eyelashes are freezing together. The body is triaging itself in real time, sacrificing the perimeter to save the center. And they keep walking, together, downhill, toward the dark smudge of the tree line that grows incrementally closer with every step. At approximately 2:17 in the morning, if we split the estimated window, if we place the moment where the math says it should go, 9 people reach the edge of the forest. They are already dying. They may not know it yet, because hypothermia is a liar and a thief, and it takes your judgment before it takes your life. But the process is underway. Their core temperatures have dropped. Their cognitive function is diminishing. The decisions they make from this point forward will be progressively less rational, not because they're stupid, but because the cold is editing their brains in real time, deleting capacity they'll need and can't get back. They reach the cedar tree, the big one, the one they could see from the slope, the landmark, the target. They've made it. Now they have to survive. The group fragments here, not violently. There's no evidence of conflict or disagreement, but the unity of the walk down the slope dissolves into smaller decisions, smaller groups, and the divergence that will determine where each of them is found. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko stay at the cedar. They're going to build a fire. This is the right decision. Fire means warmth, light, a signal, a center of gravity for the group. They begin breaking branches. The lower limbs come off with effort, but manageable effort. Then they go higher. Krivonishenko climbs, or Doroshenko climbs, or both, taking turns. And they begin tearing branches from the tree at heights that require them to wedge themselves into the trunk's branching structure and pull with their full body weight. The bark bites into their hands. Their fingers are too cold to feel it, but the skin tears anyway, and blood and tissue embed themselves in the rough cedar bark. 5 meters, 16 feet, in the dark, in their underwear. They climb until they can see. From up there, from the top of the tree, swaying in the wind, clinging to a branch with hands that are losing the ability to grip, they can see back up the slope. The tent is up there, invisible now in the dark and distance, but the ridge is a line against the sky, and the slope is a gray expanse falling away below it. If anything is moving on that slope, anything with light, with shape, with presence, they would see it from here. Were they looking? Or were they just getting firewood? I don't know. But I know they climbed higher than firewood required. And I know the branches they broke at the top of the tree were too small and too green to be useful for burning. You don't risk a 5-meter fall in a survival situation for kindling that won't catch. You do it for information. Below them, the other 7, no. Below them, the other 6, plus 1. I keep forgetting that Zolotaryov is in this count, but not of this group. Not really. Not in the way the students are. He's 38, he's military, he's carrying a camera. Whatever the others are feeling, the animal panic of young people in mortal danger, Zolotaryov is experiencing something adjacent to it, but not identical. He's been in danger before. Real danger. Wartime danger. The kind that teaches you to observe while you're terrified, because the observation might be what saves you, or at least it might be what survives you. The 6, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, Dubinina, Kolevatov, Thibault-Brignol, and Zolotaryov move further into the forest. Why they leave the cedar is unclear. Perhaps they're searching for better shelter. Perhaps they're gathering materials for a more substantial fire. Perhaps the cedar doesn't feel safe enough. Too exposed, too visible, too close to whatever is on the slope. The fire catches. Barely. Green wood smoldering, smoking, producing heat that's more theoretical than actual. Doroshenko and Krivonashenko huddle near it. Their bodies are deep into hypothermia now. The shivering that started 30 minutes ago has stopped, which is the worst possible sign, because shivering is the body's last active defense against cold. And when it stops, it means the body has given up fighting and is beginning to shut down. The paradoxical warmth arrives. It comes like a lie dressed as mercy. The failing thermoregulatory system sends a final, confused signal. You're hot. You're overheating. Take off your clothes. And they do. Doroshenko removes his jacket. Krivonashenko pulls at his undershirt. They're dying, and their bodies are telling them they're fine. And the cruelty of it, the biological betrayal, is the kind of detail that makes you want to look away from the page. They reach toward the fire. Not to warm themselves. They're past warming. But the fire is there, and their hands find it, and the flames that should register as pain register instead as sensation, the last sensation, the only input still reaching a brain that's going dark. Third-degree burns on their fingers. They don't pull back. Yuri Doroshenko dies first, or Yuri Krivonashenko dies first. We don't know the order. We know they died at the base of the cedar, within reach of each other, near a fire that was already going out. 2 young men who climbed a tree in the dark and tore it apart with their bare hands and came back down and couldn't keep the fire lit and couldn't keep their clothes on and couldn't stay alive. They were 21 and 23 years old. The fire dies with them, or shortly after. The return, at some point. And the timeline here is maddeningly imprecise. 3 members of the group decide to go back. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin. Back up the slope, back toward the tent. Back toward the thing they fled. This is either the most heroic or the most desperate decision any of them makes. The tent has their boots, their coats, their survival gear. If they can reach it, if they can retrieve even a fraction of their equipment, the rest of the group might live. It's a mile, uphill, in the dark, in the cold. In their current condition, it might as well be 100 miles. But the alternative is staying in the forest and dying slowly, and these are people who don't stay, who don't wait, who do. Dyatlov goes. Of course Dyatlov goes. He's the leader. The plan was his. The route was his. The campsite that shouldn't have been there, was his decision. Whatever guilt or responsibility he's carrying, it propels him up that slope. Kolmogorova goes. The diarist, the one who recorded everything. She goes because the people she loves are dying, and she cannot sit at the base of a tree and watch. Slobodin goes. With his cracked skull, if he has it already, if the injury happened during the initial evacuation or the descent, then he's walking uphill with a 6mm depression fracture and a headache that would bring most people to their knees. If the fracture happens during the return, a fall on the icy slope, a stumble, a collision with a rock hidden under the snow, then it happens alone, in the dark, and he gets up and keeps walking. None of them makes it. Dyatlov is found farthest from the cedar, closest to the tent. 300 meters from the tree, lying on his back, one arm raised. He made it farther than the others. He was still trying. The raised arm has been interpreted as a defensive posture, or a reaching gesture, or the involuntary muscle contraction of a body in its final spasm. It doesn't matter which. What matters is the direction he was facing. He was facing uphill, toward the tent, still going. Kolmogorova is found farther back, face down, curled into herself. The fetal position. The body's last attempt at heat conservation when every other system has failed. She was closer to the cedar than to the tent. She didn't make it as far as Dyatlov. She fell, and the cold held her down, and she didn't get up. Slobodin is between them, one boot on, one bare foot, a hat, a jacket, more clothing than the others, suggesting he either dressed faster during the tent evacuation or received garments from someone else. And the skull fracture. 6 millimeters of cracked bone that the official report says was survivable. Technically true, meaningfully cruel. He survived it long enough to walk several hundred meters in the wrong direction through conditions that would kill a healthy person. The fracture didn't kill him. The mountain did. The fracture just made sure it hurt more. 3 bodies on the slope, strung out between the cedar and the tent like markers on a trail that goes nowhere. They're found in positions that tell a story of diminishing returns, each one a little farther, a little more determined, a little more defeated. They were going back. They believed there was something to go back to, or they believed that trying was better than stopping. They were wrong on at least one of those counts. The ravine. The remaining 4, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, Thibaut Brignol, do not go back. They go deeper into the forest. 75 meters from the cedar, in a ravine carved by a small stream, they find or make a shelter. A snow den. A hollow dug into the bank of the ravine, partially covered with branches and snow, insulated as well as bare hands and failing bodies can manage. They've taken clothing from the dead at the cedar. Dubinina is wearing Krivonishenko's trousers. Zolotaryov has Dubinina's coat. They've redistributed what they have among those still living, making the grim calculus of survival. Who is coldest? Who is most likely to last? Who needs the extra layer more? It's rational. It's practiced. Survival protocol executed by people whose training is still functioning even as their bodies are failing. And for a time, we don't know how long, but the medical evidence suggests hours, not minutes. They survive. They're in the den. They're out of the wind. They have some insulation. Their core temperatures are low, but not yet lethal. If the night passes and the sun rises, and they can make it back to the tent or to the supply cache, they might live. It's not probable, but it's possible. And then something happens to them. The injuries, the ones that don't make sense. Thibaut Brignol's skull, caved in by a force that didn't break the skin. Dubinina's ribs, fractured bilaterally, both sides of her chest, crushed inward with a violence the medical examiner said was comparable to a car crash. Zolotaryov's ribs, the same. Kolevatov, less dramatically injured, but dead alongside them. These injuries were not caused by falling. The force distribution is wrong. A fall produces impact on one side, not bilateral compression. They were not caused by fighting. There are no defensive wounds, no bruising on the hands, no evidence of interpersonal violence. They were not caused by a simple avalanche or snow collapse. The den was intact when found. The bodies were not buried by debris, and the injuries are too severe and too focused for the diffuse pressure of shifting snow. Something crushed them. From outside their bodies, through their clothes and skin without marking the surface, and into their bones with enough force to shatter them. And it did this selectively. Dubinina and Zolotaryov received the worst of it. Thibaut Brignol, the skull fracture, Kolevatov, relatively little. As if the force had a direction. As if it came from one side and hit some of them harder than others based on their position in the den. Dubinina is found with her face in the frozen stream bed. Her mouth is open. I've described the absence of her tongue. I've described the clinical language of the autopsy report. What I haven't described, because I've been avoiding it, is what the final minutes of her life might have been like. She has multiple broken ribs, bilateral. The pain of a single broken rib is frequently described as the worst pain people have experienced. A stabbing, constant agony that intensifies with every breath, because breathing requires the ribs to move, and movement is what the brake won't allow. Dubinina has multiple fractures on both sides. Every breath is a negotiation between the need for air and the cost of getting it. Short, shallow, agonizing gasps that don't provide enough oxygen, so the body demands deeper breaths, which cause more pain, which triggers the gasping reflex, which... She's in a snow den, in the dark. She can hear the others or she can't, because Thibaut Brignol's skull fracture may have rendered him unconscious or dead, and Zolotaryov's chest injuries mirror hers, meaning he's in the same impossible breathing cycle. And Kolevatov is... where? Beside her? Trying to help? Trying to understand what just happened to 3 of his friends in a space the size of a closet? Zolotaryov's camera is still around his neck. The strap presses against his broken chest. Every micro-movement shifts the weight of it, and the weight is nothing, a few hundred grams. But against fractured ribs, a few hundred grams is a presence that the body cannot ignore. He kept it, through everything. He is keeping it still. They die in the ravine, probably within hours of the injuries, probably in the dark, probably aware, at least intermittently, of what is happening and unable to change it. The snow begins to fall. It covers them slowly, centimeter by centimeter, day by day, week by week, until 4 meters of white silence sits between them and the sky. The stream continues to run beneath the snow, threading water through and around the bodies, carrying away warmth that's no longer there, and beginning the long, slow work of reclamation that the living will later interpret as mystery. The snow preserves, the snow erases, and it won't tell you which is which until spring. The uncomfortable possibilities. The things we don't say out loud. We're back in the past tense now. Back in the file. Back in the business of trying to make sense of something that resists the effort with what I can only describe as structural hostility. I've spent the last hour showing you what was found, the evidence, the details, the accumulation of things that are individually explicable and collectively impossible. And I've been very careful up to this point not to tell you what I think happened. Partly because I don't know. Partly because the case has been damaged by too many people who do know, who are very certain, who have selected their favorite theory and reverse-engineered the evidence to fit it. I don't want to do that. What I want to do instead is walk you through the explanations that have been offered. Not all of them, because there are dozens, and most of them aren't worth your time, but the ones that are almost good enough. The ones that explain 80% of the evidence and then collapse under the weight of the remaining 20. Because the 20% is where this case lives. It lives in the gap between the best available explanation and the facts that refuse to cooperate with it. I'm going to present each possibility as fairly as I can. I'm going to give it the best version of its argument, and then I'm going to show you what it can't account for. Not because I enjoy dismantling theories. I don't. I find it exhausting. But because intellectual honesty requires it, and this case has suffered from a deficit of intellectual honesty for 66 years. The avalanche that wasn't. We should start here because this is the explanation that the Russian government has chosen, twice. In 2019, Russian prosecutors reopened the Dyatlov case, or appeared to. They announced a new investigation, which generated international media coverage and the momentary hope among researchers that modern forensic techniques would finally crack it open. The investigation was restricted from the outset to 3 possible explanations: avalanche, snow slab, or hurricane-force winds. Foul play was explicitly excluded. Military involvement was explicitly excluded. Other factors, a category so vast and so vague that excluding it essentially meant excluding the unknown, were explicitly excluded. They concluded slab avalanche, a delayed release of a compacted snow slab above the tent, triggered by the combination of the group's campsite excavation, the slope angle, and overnight temperature changes. The slab, they argued, struck the tent, caused the injuries to some members, and triggered the panic evacuation that led to the rest dying of exposure. The theory has the advantage of simplicity. It requires no conspiracies, no military involvement, no mysterious forces. It's a natural disaster, the kind of thing that happens in mountains to experienced hikers with depressing regularity. And in 2020, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment that used computer modeling to demonstrate that a small, delayed slab avalanche was physically possible at the campsite location, given the right combination of conditions. The study was well constructed, the modeling was sophisticated. The conclusion was that a slab avalanche of relatively modest size could produce enough force to cause the chest and skull injuries observed on the ravine floor while leaving the tent largely intact. It's a reasonable explanation. And it accounts for more of the evidence than any other single theory. But more is not all, and the gaps are significant enough to be fatal. The footprints. This is the simplest and most devastating objection. The group's footprints leading away from the tent were intact. They were preserved by snow compaction and remained visible for 25 days. A slab avalanche, even a small one, would have obliterated those footprints. An avalanche doesn't politely step over the evidence of what preceded it. It buries everything. The footprints survived because nothing heavy or fast moved over the ground between the tent and the tree line after the group walked it. The tent. When found, the tent was partially collapsed but still partially standing. Its ski pole supports were still in place. The fabric was cut but not crushed. A slab avalanche sufficient to cause the injuries documented on the ravine floor, injuries the medical examiner compared to a car crash, would have flattened the tent entirely. It would have snapped the ski poles. It would have buried the equipment. The tent shows damage consistent with being cut from inside and weathered by 25 days of wind. It does not show damage consistent with being struck by a wall of compacted snow. The timing. The crush injuries were found on bodies in the ravine, 75 meters from the cedar tree, 1.5 kilometers from the tent. These injuries occurred hours after the tent evacuation. The ravine floor survived long enough to walk to the cedar, strip clothing from the dead, continue to the ravine, construct a shelter, and settle in before whatever killed them arrived. If an avalanche at the tent caused these injuries, the victims would have been found at the tent. They weren't. The injuries happened somewhere else at some other time. The slope angle. The campsite was on a slope of approximately 15 to 18 degrees. Slab avalanches can occur on slopes as shallow as 25 degrees under specific conditions, but 15 to 18 is at the extreme lower boundary. The 2020 study acknowledges this and argues that the specific conditions, a particular snow crystal structure, a specific wind loading pattern, the group's excavation of the tent platform, could have lowered the threshold. It's possible, but it requires a precise convergence of factors that the researchers themselves describe as unusual. The behavior. Even if we accept the avalanche as the trigger, the thing that caused the initial panic, the group's subsequent behavior doesn't match avalanche response. Avalanche survivors, when they're trained, do specific things. They dig themselves out, they account for buried members, they retrieve equipment, they signal for help. Avalanche survivors, when they're untrained, do other specific things. They panic, they scatter, they run in random directions. The Dyatlov group did neither. They left the tent in orderly fashion, walked together in formation for 1.5 kilometers, and then calmly separated into task groups. This is not the behavior of people who've just been hit by a slab of snow. This is the behavior of people who've assessed a threat and made a collective decision to move away from it. An avalanche is not a threat you walk away from. It's a threat that's already happened. And then there's the radiation, and the suppressed evidence, and the luminous objects, and the camera on a dead man's chest, and the tent fabric cut from outside. The avalanche explains none of these things, and the 2019 investigation didn't try to make it explain them, because the investigation was designed from the start to arrive at a natural explanation. When you restrict your inquiry to natural causes, you will find a natural cause. That's not investigation. That's confirmation with a badge. The Dyatlov Memorial Foundation rejected the finding. The families rejected it. Independent researchers rejected it. Yuri Kuntsevich, the head of the foundation, said something that I think captures the frustration perfectly. He said, and I'm paraphrasing from the Russian, they opened the case to close it again. They just wanted a different lock. The military theory. If the avalanche is the explanation the government wants you to believe, the military theory is the one the government really doesn't want you to believe. Which, depending on your epistemological framework, either makes it more or less credible. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were not pristine wilderness. They were Soviet territory during the Cold War, and the Soviet military used remote regions for testing with a frequency and casualness that would be remarkable if it weren't so well documented. Missile tests, weapons tests, atmospheric experiments. The Urals were, for practical purposes, an outdoor laboratory with no civilian oversight and no obligation to inform anyone about what was being detonated, launched, or released. The military theory comes in several variants, but the core argument is this. The Dyatlov group either stumbled into an active military test or was deliberately exposed to one, and the subsequent investigation was suppressed to protect the military's operational secrecy. The most sophisticated version of this theory involves thermobaric or fuel-air ordnance. These weapons, which were being developed by several nations in the 1950s, though the Soviet program is less well documented than the American one, operate by dispersing a cloud of combustible material and then igniting it. The resulting explosion produces two things that are directly relevant to the Dyatlov case: a massive pressure wave and a brief, intense heat pulse. The pressure wave from a thermobaric weapon is different from a conventional explosion. It's longer. A conventional blast wave spikes and drops. A thermobaric wave rolls. It arrives as a sustained compression that can rupture internal organs, fracture bones, and cause the specific pattern of damage that the Dyatlov medical examiner documented: catastrophic internal trauma without corresponding external injury. The pressure crushes you from every direction simultaneously. And because the force is diffuse rather than focal, it doesn't break the skin. It breaks what's underneath. This would account for the chest injuries. It would account for the skull fractures. Overpressure can cause precisely the kind of widespread cranial depression that Thibaut Brignol presented. It would account for the lack of external trauma, and it would potentially account for the radiation, because some Soviet weapons programs in this era were experimenting with radiological enhancement, so-called salted weapons that combined conventional or thermobaric warheads with radiological material to increase the contamination footprint. The luminous spheres? Rocket exhaust. Missile tests. The Soviet R-7 and R-12 missile programs were actively testing in the late 1950s, and the visual signature of a rocket launch at night, a bright, moving light against a dark sky, matches the witness descriptions with uncomfortable precision. The suppressed evidence? Obviously, if the military killed 9 civilians through a test gone wrong, the investigation would be shut down. The evidence would be classified, and the lead investigator would be told to write compelling natural force and go home. It's compelling. It's probably the most comprehensive single theory available. And it has problems. The first is temporal. The crush injuries were sustained in the ravine hours after the tent evacuation. If a military weapon caused the injuries, it was deployed at the ravine, not at the tent. But the group fled the tent before the injuries occurred. What drove them out? A thermobaric detonation at the tent would have killed them at the tent. Something else caused the evacuation, and the weapon, if it was a weapon, came later. This requires 2 separate events, hours apart, in the same remote area, targeting the same group. That's not impossible, but it's complex, and complexity is the enemy of theory. The second is evidence of ordnance. No fragments, no blast crater, no chemical residue on the bodies or clothing that would indicate explosive material. The radiation is suggestive but not specific. Beta contamination is consistent with dozens of sources, not just military ordnance. The absence of physical evidence of a weapon doesn't disprove the theory, but it weakens it considerably. The third is Zolotaryov. If the military theory is true, Zolotaryov's role becomes a question the theory has to answer. Was he a planted observer? A military asset embedded in the group to document the test? If so, the test killed the observer, which implies either catastrophic miscalculation or an observer who wasn't supposed to be in the blast zone and wandered into it. His camera, carried to his death, takes on a different significance in this framework. Not the instinct of a documentarian, but the duty of one. And here's the detail that the military theory introduces and can't resolve. Why this group? If the military was testing weapons in the Urals, they didn't need a group of hikers as unwitting subjects. The mountains were empty. The test could have been conducted without witnesses. Unless the group was specifically targeted, and there's no evidence of that, their presence at the test site would have been an accident, a coincidence. And the elaborate cover-up that followed would have been triggered not by a deliberate act, but by the military's need to conceal an accidental atrocity. That's the reading that Lev Ivanov eventually arrived at, though he never used the word atrocity. He said, in his 1990 interviews, that he believed the group encountered something connected to military activity, and that the investigation was suppressed to protect that secret. He didn't have proof. He had 30 years of suppressed evidence, classified witness statements, and the persistent nagging certainty that the people who ordered him to close the case knew more than they were willing to say. The infrasound. This is the theory that keeps me up at night, not because it's the most dramatic, it isn't, but because it's the most elegant, and elegance in a theory is either a sign of truth or a sign of a beautiful lie. When wind passes over certain topographical formations, ridges, peaks, rock outcroppings with specific geometries, it can generate sound waves at frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, below 20 hertz. These are called infrasound, and they are, in a very real sense, invisible. You can't hear them. You don't know they're there. But your body knows. The physics of infrasound interaction with the human body are well documented and deeply unsettling. At frequencies between 7 and 12 hertz, infrasound can produce a pervasive, sourceless sense of anxiety, nausea and dizziness, difficulty breathing, visual disturbances caused by vibration of the eyeball at its resonant frequency, blurred vision, the perception of shapes or movement in the peripheral vision that aren't there, cardiac arrhythmia, and, in sustained or intense exposure, a profound, unshakable sense of dread. Not fear of something specific. Dread. The feeling that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong, without any identifiable cause. In 2019, Donnie Eichar, an American filmmaker and writer who spent years investigating the case, published a detailed analysis arguing that the specific topography of Kholat Syakhl, the shape of the ridge, the angle of the slope, the rock formations near the campsite, could produce a phenomenon called a Kármán vortex street under sustained high wind conditions. This is an atmospheric effect where wind flowing over an obstacle sheds alternating vortices in a rhythmic pattern, generating infrasound at a specific, predictable frequency determined by the wind speed and the obstacle geometry. Eichar's analysis, supported by atmospheric scientists and acousticians, suggested that the conditions on the night of February 1st sustained high winds from a consistent direction, interacting with the specific rock formations of Kholat Syakhl, could have generated infrasound in the 7 to 12 hertz range, the range that affects the human body, the range that produces anxiety, dread, visual disturbance, and panic. Imagine it. You're in the tent, you're trying to sleep, and slowly, without any conscious awareness, your heart rate increases. Your breathing becomes shallow. You feel wrong. Not afraid. You're not afraid of anything because there's nothing to be afraid of. But wrong. Deeply, cellularly wrong, in a way that has no name and no source. The person next to you is restless too. Everyone is restless. The wind sounds the same as it always does, but something underneath it, something below hearing, below awareness, below the threshold of recognition, is pressing against your body from the inside. And it builds, minute by minute. The anxiety sharpens, the dread congeals. Your eyes are playing tricks. You see movement in the shadows of the tent that isn't there, shapes at the periphery that dissolve when you look directly. Someone says they feel sick. Someone else says they can't breathe. The feeling is unanimous and inexplicable, and it's getting worse. And at some point, some critical threshold of accumulated physiological and psychological distress, someone says the words that start the sequence. We need to get out. And they're not wrong. They do need to get out. The tent is the problem. The tent's position on the slope in the vortex zone is generating the infrasound that's making them sick with terror. Leaving the tent is the correct response. The only correct response, because you can't fight a sound you can't hear. You can only leave the area where it's being generated. So they cut, they run. And as they descend the slope, away from the ridge, away from the rock formations, into the shelter of the tree line where the topography breaks up the vortex and the infrasound attenuates, the panic subsides. Slowly. The dread lifts, the heart rate drops, rational thought returns, and they find themselves standing in the forest, barefoot, in -30, with all their equipment on a slope they can't go back to because their bodies won't let them. The elegance of this theory is almost offensive. It explains the coordinated panic without requiring an external threat. It explains the orderly evacuation. Infrasound-induced flight is purposeful, not chaotic, because the imperative is to leave the area, not to flee a pursuer. It explains why the group didn't return for their equipment. They couldn't. The infrasound was still there. Their bodies would have revolted at the approach. It explains the campsite location as the critical factor, not what happened to the group, but where they camped. Yudin was right. The location was the key, and it fails. It fails on the injuries. Infrasound, even at extreme intensities, does not crush ribs, it does not fracture skulls. It causes physiological distress, cognitive impairment, and panic, but it does not produce the force that the medical examiner compared to a car crash. The Ravine 4 were not killed by infrasound. Whatever killed them was something else, something that the infrasound theory has no mechanism to provide. It fails on the radiation. Infrasound is acoustic energy. It has no radiological component. The contaminated clothing is simply outside the theory's explanatory range, and it fails on the lights. The luminous spheres reported by multiple witnesses, the ones that Lev Ivanov was ordered to suppress, are not a product of wind interacting with rock. They require a separate explanation, which means the infrasound theory either coexists with another phenomenon, conveniently unidentified, or it accounts for the panic and nothing else. The theory that most disturbs the people who study it, not because it's the most dramatic, but because it means the mountain itself was the threat. And you can't interrogate a mountain. You can't file charges against a wind pattern. You can't close a case against a frequency. The pattern, I want to end this section not with a theory, but with a question. The kind of question that serious researchers ask quietly, in private, after the conference presentations are over and the recording equipment is off. Has this happened before? In 1973, on the Shivroy Pass in the Lovozero tundra, approximately 2,000 kilometers west of Kholat Syakhl, but in similar subarctic mountain terrain, a group of 10 hikers died under circumstances that the official investigation attributed to hypothermia. They were experienced. They were well-equipped. They abandoned their camp, leaving survival gear behind. They were found scattered across the mountainside in positions and states of undress that indicated panic, disorientation, and paradoxical undressing. The investigation was brief. The conclusion was unsatisfying. The case is largely unknown outside Russia. In 1993, on the Kamar-Daban mountain range in Siberia, a group of 7 hikers were struck by a sudden, inexplicable incapacitation. One survivor, a woman named Valentina Utachenko, described the onset as rapid and total. Group members began walking in circles, falling down, foaming at the mouth, losing the ability to speak or respond coherently. Within hours, 6 of the 7 were dead. Utachenko survived by separating from the group and descending alone. She was found in severe distress, unable to fully articulate what had happened. The official cause of death for the 6 was listed as hypothermia. The cause of the sudden behavioral collapse was never determined. Utachenko's description of her group's disintegration is the closest thing that exists to a first-person account of whatever happened to the Dyatlov group. The parallels are striking and uncomfortable. Experienced hikers, remote mountain terrain, sudden onset of incapacitating symptoms with no identifiable cause, abandonment of equipment, scattered bodies, an official explanation that explains the deaths, but not the behavior that preceded them. I'm not drawing a line between these cases. I'm aware of the dangers of pattern finding. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine that will find connections in random noise if you let it. And the history of unsolved cases is littered with false connections that felt compelling at the time and led nowhere. But I'm also aware that these 3 incidents share a specific set of characteristics that is, at minimum, worth noting. Remote mountain location above or near the tree line. Experienced, well-equipped hikers. Sudden onset of panic or behavioral disorientation with no identified trigger. Abandonment of survival equipment. Orderly initial evacuation followed by group fragmentation. Deaths attributed to exposure but preceded by behavior that exposure alone doesn't explain. Official investigations that closed quickly and concluded vaguely. The Dyatlov Pass incident occurred on February 1st, 1959. The Shivruay Pass incident occurred in 1973. The Khamar Daban incident occurred on August 5th, 1993. 34 years span the first two, 20 years span the second and third. If you count the days between the Dyatlov and Khamar Daban incidents, if you're the kind of person who counts, and I apparently am, you arrive at a number in the neighborhood of 12,603. Divided among the total dead across all three incidents, 9, then 10, then 6, the number doesn't resolve into anything clean. It doesn't become a pattern, it doesn't become a motif, it's just a number. But the 217th day after January 1st, 1959, if you start counting from the new year, if you count to the day the Dyatlov investigation was formally closed, falls on May 28th, the day the case was sealed. And the 217th day after August 5th, 1993, the date of the Khamar Daban incident, falls on March 10th, 1994, a date of no particular significance in the public record. But March 10th is also the birthday of Semyon Zolotaryov, the man who didn't quite belong, the man with the camera. That means nothing. I want to be clear. That means nothing. Coincidence is not causation. Numerology is not evidence. But I told you at the beginning that I'm the kind of person who sees patterns in static, and I'm telling you now that this particular pattern is the one that keeps me reading the file at hours when I should be sleeping. This has happened before. Maybe not for the same reason, maybe not through the same mechanism, but the shape of it, the template, the architecture of the event, has repeated in different mountains, in different decades, to different people. And each time, the investigation closes with the same unsatisfying shrug, and each time, the details that don't fit are filed away, and each time, the mountains keep whatever they know. I'm not claiming anything. I'm just suggesting that if you wanted to look for a thread connecting incidents of unexplained group death in remote mountain terrain across the second half of the 20th century, you wouldn't have to look very hard. And that's the thing about patterns. They don't need you to believe in them. They just need you to notice. The lingering question, and no one has ever explained why. There's a man I've been circling for the past 3 hours, and I think it's time to sit with him. Lev Nikitich Ivanov was a regional prosecutor in the Sverdlovsk Oblast when the Dyatlov case landed on his desk. He was not a high-ranking official. He was not a specialist in unusual deaths. He was a mid-career Soviet legal functionary who had spent his professional life in the bureaucratic machinery of regional law enforcement, processing cases that were, for the most part, exactly as mundane as they appeared. Theft, assault, fraud, the ordinary catalog of human failure. He was, by all accounts, competent, methodical, and unremarkable. The kind of man the system produced in quantity and relied upon to keep the gears turning without asking why they turned. The Dyatlov case was not mundane, and Ivanov, to his credit and to his lasting torment, knew it almost immediately. He ran the investigation properly. He cataloged the evidence. He ordered the autopsies, the radiological analysis, the witness interviews. He followed the threads where they led, to the radiation, to the lights in the sky, to the military activity in the region, to the inconsistencies that I've spent tonight laying out for you. He wrote his findings down. He was a man of the file, and the file was growing into something that the system was not built to contain. And then Moscow called. The specifics of what was communicated to Ivanov have never been fully established, because Soviet internal communications of this nature were verbal, not written. You didn't put certain instructions on paper. But Ivanov, in interviews given decades later, described the substance clearly enough. He was told to close the case. He was told to conclude with a natural cause, He was told specifically to remove the radiological findings and the witness reports of luminous aerial phenomena from the final report. And he was told, "This is the detail that always stops me not to discuss the case further." He complied. Of course he complied. This was 1959. This was the Soviet Union. You did not defy instructions from Moscow and continue your career, or in some cases your liberty, or in some cases your life. Ivanov wrote, "Compelling natural force," and sealed the file and went back to processing theft cases in Sverdlovsk. He was a gear. He turned. But he kept his working notes. He kept the drafts. He kept the radiological data and the witness statements and the photographs that didn't make the final cut. He kept them the way a man keeps a stone in his shoe. Not because he wants it there, but because removing it would mean admitting that the walk he took was in the wrong direction. 31 years later, in 1990, the Soviet Union was disintegrating. The structures that had enforced silence were crumbling. The people who had given the orders were dead or irrelevant. And Lev Ivanov, now retired, gave an interview to a regional newspaper in which he said 3 things that he had been carrying since 1959. The first, he had been ordered to close the case by senior officials, and the order was connected to the suppression of specific evidence. The second, the suppressed evidence included radiological findings and reports of luminous phenomena, both of which he believed were relevant to the cause of death. The third, and this is the one that matters, the one that distinguishes Ivanov from a simple whistleblower and turns him into something more complicated and more human. He said that, in his professional judgment, the Dyatlov group had encountered something that was beyond the scope of human understanding at the time. Now, that phrase has been seized upon by every faction of Dyatlov theorists for their own purposes. The UFO camp reads it as confirmation. The military camp reads it as a coded reference to classified weapons. The paranormal camp reads it as an admission of the inexplicable. Everyone hears what they want to hear. But I want to take Ivanov at his word, not at the word his interpreters give him, at his word, beyond the scope of human understanding at the time. That's not the language of a man who saw aliens. It's not the language of a man who found a weapons fragment. It's the language of a man who looked at all the evidence, all of it, including the parts he was told to suppress, and could not construct a single coherent explanation that accounted for everything. Who tried, who was trained to try, and who failed? That's not mysticism. That's professional humility. The admission that the evidence exceeds the available frameworks, that the file is too large for the cabinet. Ivanov said one more thing in those later interviews, and it's the one that gets quoted least, because it's the least dramatic. If I had been allowed to continue the investigation, I believe I would have found the answer, but I would not have been allowed to publish it. Read that again. He's not saying the answer is unknowable. He's saying it's unpublishable. That the truth, whatever it is, belongs to a category of information that the state, any state perhaps, would not permit to be public. That's not the statement of a man who saw something impossible. It's the statement of a man who saw something inconvenient. Something that, if revealed, would require explanations that someone powerful was unwilling to give. Ivanov died in 1999. He never published his full findings. His working notes survived him and have been partially released through the efforts of the Dyatlov Foundation and independent researchers. They are fragmented, incomplete, and suggestive, the scattered pages of a book that was never allowed to be bound. The Russian government reopened the case in 2019 and closed it again in 2020 with the avalanche verdict. I've described the problems with that conclusion. I want to describe one more: the manner of the investigation. The 2019 inquiry was not conducted by independent investigators. It was conducted by prosecutors from the same institutional lineage as the original 1959 investigation. The same office, the same structure, the same chain of authority. They restricted their inquiry to natural explanations before they began. They did not interview independent researchers. They did not incorporate the decades of analysis conducted by the Dyatlov Foundation. They did not address the radiation, the suppressed evidence, the luminous phenomena, the military activity, or any of the details that have sustained the case as an open question for 60 years. They produced an answer. The answer is avalanche. The answer is, by their own methodology, the only answer they were permitted to find. They opened the case to close it again. They just wanted a different lock. I don't know if Kuntsevich was right about everything, but he was right about that. The 2019 investigation was not an investigation. It was a renovation, a fresh coat of paint on the same sealed door. So where does that leave us? It's late. You've been with me for a while. I've taken you through the evidence, through the cracks, through the experience, through the theories, and I haven't given you an answer. That might feel unsatisfying. If so, I understand. We live in an era of answers, of podcasts that solve, of documentaries that reveal, of content that promises closure and delivers it with a ribbon on top. I haven't done that. I've done the opposite. I've laid out the pieces and shown you that they don't fit together, and I'm asking you to sit with that. But I want to give you something to take with you. Not an answer. A frame. Whatever happened on Kholat Syakhl on the night of February 1st, 1959, it had to satisfy, simultaneously, every one of the following conditions. It was terrifying enough to override the survival instincts of 9 experienced winter hikers. It was present at or near the tent, specifically because the tent was what they fled. It was not present at the cedar tree, 1.5 kilometers away, because the group stopped there and attempted to survive. It was consistent with an orderly, coordinated evacuation. Not a stampede, not a chaotic flight, but a decision made together. It produced injuries, hours later and 75 meters from the cedar, that crushed ribs and skulls without breaking skin. Injuries that the medical examiner compared to a car crash. It left radioactive traces on the clothing. It coincided with luminous aerial phenomena reported by independent witnesses across the region. It was significant enough that the Soviet government ordered evidence suppressed and an investigation closed. It fits a pattern of similar incidents in similar terrain across multiple decades. Every theory I've presented satisfies some of these conditions. No theory I've presented, no theory anyone has presented in 66 years of analysis satisfies all of them. If you find one that does, you've done something that Lev Ivanov couldn't do, that Yuri Yudin spent 54 years failing to do, that 2 separate Russian government investigations either couldn't or wouldn't do. The file is open. It's always been open. The trouble was never access. The trouble is that the deeper you go, the more you find that wasn't supposed to be there. Notes in the margins, measurements that don't match, a camera on a dead man's chest, a tree with blood on the bark 5 meters up, a number that keeps appearing in places where it shouldn't, and a mountain that the people who lived there named dead long before anyone had to agree with them. I want to close with the mountain itself, because the mountain is still there. Kholat Syakhl hasn't changed. The ridge is the same. The slope is the same. The rock formations that may or may not generate infrasound in high wind are the same. The tree line below, thinned now by decades of additional growth and die-off, is still there. The cedar, or what remains of it, is still there. In 1963, the pass where the group was found was officially renamed. It's now called Dyatlov Pass. After Igor, the leader, the planner, the 23-year-old engineering student who pitched his tent on a slope he shouldn't have been on for reasons that no one has explained. It seemed like the right thing to do. A memorial, a tribute, a way of saying, we remember, we honor what happened here. And maybe that's all it is. But if you're the kind of person who thinks about language, and by now you know that I am, there's something uncomfortable about naming a place of death after a person who died there. It doesn't memorialize the tragedy. It locates it. It says this is where it happened, this is the spot, the coordinates, the address of the event. And if the event was singular, a one-time catastrophe, an avalanche, a freak convergence of natural forces, then naming the pass is a memorial and nothing more. A plaque on a wall, a line in a registry, the case is closed. But if the event was not singular, if the mountain does something, as the Mansi said, not once but repeatedly, not to one group but to anyone who lingers in the wrong place at the wrong time, then the name is not a memorial, it's a label. A warning written in a format that looks like an honor. This is where it happened. this is where it still is. The Mansi didn't say the mountain was cursed. They said the mountain does something. They lived in its shadow for centuries, and they named it Dead Mountain, and they didn't go there. Not because they were afraid of ghosts, because they were practical people who had observed over generations that the mountain was not a safe place to be. That people who went to the mountain did not come back the same, if they came back at all. We've spent 66 years trying to explain the Dyatlov Pass incident with the tools of forensic science, military intelligence, atmospheric physics, and bureaucratic investigation, and we failed. Not for lack of effort, not for lack of evidence, but because the evidence exceeds every framework we've brought to it, and the frameworks we haven't tried are the ones we're not comfortable naming. The Mansi had a framework. They just weren't interested in explaining it to us. It's late. I've kept you a long time. The file is on the desk, and the desk lamp is the only light in the room. And outside the window, the dark is the specific kind of dark that comes at the very end of the night, just before the sky begins to think about getting lighter. Not dawn. The memory of the possibility of dawn. I don't have an answer for you. I have a case that's been open for 66 years, and a mountain that was dead long before anyone proved it. I have 9 names and a 10th who carried them for the rest of his life. I have a tent that was cut from inside and possibly from outside, and a section of it that was never found. I have a cedar tree with blood in its bark and a fire that didn't burn, and a ravine where the snow kept 4 bodies like a secret for 3 months. I have radiation on the clothes and lights in the sky, and a lead investigator who was told to stop looking and never stopped thinking. And I have a number, a small one. It keeps showing up in the margins of the file, in the spaces between the things that were documented and the things that were suppressed. It doesn't mean anything. Numbers don't mean things. They measure them. But this one sits in the case like a watermark on a page, visible only when you hold it at the right angle, and once you've seen it, you can't stop seeing it. 2:17, a time on a watch that couldn't be read, a temperature that kills in minutes, a day count between incidents that shouldn't be related, a gap in the record where something should be and isn't. It threads through the case like a frequency below hearing, present, persistent, and just beyond the reach of proof. I'm going to set the file down now, not because I'm finished with it, because the night is finished with me, and the file will be here in the morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. It's been here for 66 years. It's patient, it can wait. The mountain is patient too. Sleep well.
If you're still here, you must enjoy beautifully disturbing content. Good choice. Hit subscribe.